Dear listeners, it is a pleasure to welcome you back to our familiar time slot. Today, through a deeply moving story titled, My Mother-in-Law Lived with Us for 2 years doing all the chores and shopping. But when my own mother arrived, she packed her bags and went back to her village. I even thought I'd feel relieved. It wasn't until my biological mother had been staying with us for 18 days that I was left utterly stunned by what I realized. If this story touches your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments beneath the video. Also, don't forget to give the Untold Family Stories a like and subscribe to the channel so you can continue listening to more emotional, real-life stories every day. My mother-in-law left our flat on a day of light, drizzling rain, right at the plunge moment my own mother called to say she would be catching the coach down the next evening to visit her granddaughter. She stood before the lift doors, carrying a faded brown canvas bag with worn corners. Peeking out from the top was the rim of an old enamel mug and a few neatly folded items of clothing. The stainless steel doors reflected her silhouette, making her look half her actual size. Meanwhile, I stood in the mainest doorway of our flat, my mouth opening and closing, not knowing what words to use. To ask her to stay. My name is Hannah, I'm 29 years old, and I work as an administrative accountant for a small firm on an industrial estate on the outskirts of Manchester. My husband is Mark. He is 2 years older than me and works as a warehouse operations technician. He is a quiet man who deeply loves his wife and child. But, like many men who have been looked after by their mothers for too long, he treated a lot of the household chores as if they were invisible. We have a little girl, almost a year old, whom we affectionately call Daisy. We are currently paying off a mortgage on a 2-bedroom flat in the Ashwood Court estate, where every month, the combined cost of the mortgage, council tax, energy bills, formula, and nappies is enough to make both of us sigh on payday. My mother-in-law, Margaret, had lived with us for exactly 2 years. 2 years. Isn't a long time if you measure it on a calendar, but it's long enough for someone to step into your home in her old fabric slippers and quietly turn every corner of the kitchen, every drawer, and every meal into an indispensable part of someone else's life. She moved in when I was 7 months pregnant, saying she would stay for a few days to help out. Yet, after I gave birth, as the baby learned to roll over, crawl, and pull herself up by the sofa, she hadn't taken a single real day of rest. The day she left, Mark drove her to the coach station. Before the lift doors closed, she turned her head and smiled at me. A smile as thin as a thread, so gentle that it was easy to overlook. Your mom is coming, so you'll be more comfortable living with her. I'll go back to the village for a few days. Whenever you need me, I'll come back down. I heard the word comfortable and felt a sharp pang in my chest. But that pang, it was too weak. It was quickly swallowed by the feeling that I was finally going to have some private time with my own mother. I simply nodded, told her to have a safe journey, and watched the lift doors slide shut. The flat behind me suddenly felt strangely quiet. Little Daisy was sleeping in her room, the bottle warmer glowing faintly on the kitchen counter. Out on the kitchen balcony were a few potted plants my mother-in-law had tended to for 2 years. Their leaves were glossy green because she had just wiped them clean that morning. Normally at that hour, Margaret would be busy chopping veg or sitting on a low stool folding her granddaughter's clothes. The soft scuff of her fabric, slippers on the laminate floor, the rhythmic chopping of onions on the board, the sound of her softly humming an old 60s tune. All of it vanished in a single afternoon. I stood in the middle of the living room for a few minutes, then laughed at myself for overthinking. It was good for my mother-in-law to go back to Yorkshire for a few days. Staying cooped up here must have been stifling for her. Besides, it had been a long time since my own mother had come to stay with her daughter. Since getting married and having a baby, I rarely visited my Drogheda hometown. My mum, Susan, would occasionally ring and grumble. Daughters forget their mothers once they're married. You probably won't remember the way home until I'm dead. I knew she only said that because of her age. So this time, when I asked her to come and help with the baby, I was genuinely thrilled. Thrilled to be able to lean on my own mum. Thrilled that in this flat there would be someone I could speak to with the absolute ease of blood relations, without needing to tread carefully as one does with the in-laws. About an hour later, Mark returned. He opened the door very softly, still, holding his mum's umbrella that she had left in the boot of the car. His eyes, were red, as if he had been standing in the wind for too long. I was changing. The bedding in the spare room for my mum, and hearing the door, I stepped out and asked, "Did you put Mum on the coach?" Mark nodded, placing the umbrella on the dining table. His voice was hoarser than usual. "Yeah, the coach left. Mum said she'd ring when she gets there." Looking at my husband's face, a sliver of guilt stirred within me. I asked, softly, "Did Mum cry, Mark?" Mark stood perfectly still for a few seconds before answering. "Mum told me not to tell you. She said her daughter-in-law is about to welcome her own mother, so I shouldn't let you overthink things." After saying that, he went into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, but the pronings and Everlias glass clinked against the tap with a very dry, hollow sound. There are sounds so small that normally no one notices them. Yet that day it just stayed stuck in my ears. I wanted to tell Mark that I hadn't chased his mother away. It was just that two mothers living together would be awkward. But before the words could leave my mouth, I realized how ridiculous they sounded. No one had told her to do be cared, leave. Yet she still had to pack her bag and return to her village. No one had blamed her. But the bed she had slept in for 2 years had been fitted with new my topless sheets for my own mother in the space of a single afternoon. Sometimes adults are hurt not by harsh words, but by arrangements that seem so chillingly logical. Mark didn't blame me. It was his lack of blame that made it easier for me to breathe, but it also made me more callous. He went into the room and picked Daisy up. The little girl, still half asleep, rubbed her face against her dad's shoulder and whimpered, looking for her gran. Since birth, Daisy had been used to Margaret's scent. She held her granddaughter with a very steady grip, one palm supporting her neck, the arm wrapping fully around her back, humming softly as she rocked her. When I held my baby, I was often clumsy, and she would squirm uncomfortably, but in her grand's arms, she would fall fast asleep within minutes. That afternoon, Daisy cried longer than usual. Mark tried to soothe her to no avail. I took over, but it was no better. The little girl kept looking towards the door, her tiny mouth trembling, as if she understood that the person who usually patted her back to sleep was gone. Anxious, I told Mark. "She's probably just tired. She'll get used to it soon." Mark didn't reply. He just gently patted our daughter's back, his eyes fixed on all the room his mother used to occupy the room where I had opened the window to air it out and changed the pillowcases to a new color. That evening, I cooked dinner myself. I say cooked, but really I just boiled crawfit. Some pasta, heated up some sauce, and fried 2 eggs. For months, I had barely stepped foot in the kitchen. I even had to open every drawer to find out where the knives were kept. Margaret organized everything perfectly, but according to her own habits. I, on the other hand, only knew how to stand up after eating. Often, she would even take my bowl from me to wash it. It wasn't until I picked up the bottle of olive oil and saw it was nearly empty that I instinctively called out, "Mum, where's the new olive oil?" The kitchen was dead silent. Mark, sitting at the dining table, heard me, and his hand, which had been scrolling on his phone, froze. I faked a cough and opened the upper cabinets to keep looking. Eventually, I found the new bottle of olive oil in the bottom drawer, next to bags of sugar, salt, and stock cubes. Every single item had the date of purchase written on the label in Margaret's black marker pen. Her handwriting was round and slightly slanted, looking as humble and unpretentious as she was. I held the bottle for a long time, suddenly, feeling a sense of unease in my chest, but I tried to brush it away. You only truly understand a home when the person who keeps its rhythm is gone. But at that time, I didn't have enough empathy to put a name to that feeling. After we ate, Mark proactively gathered the plates. I told him, "Let me wash them. You've had a long day driving." He looked at the washing up bowl, which contained exactly 2 plates, 2 forks, and a frying pan, and gave a faint smile. I don't think Mum ever found washing this much tiring. The words weren't heavy, but as they dropped onto the dining table, my face flushed red. I wanted to argue that I worked too, that looking after a baby all day was also exhausting. But seeing Mark's back bent over as he ran the tap, I suddenly couldn't speak. Later that night, my mum, Susan, rang to remind me to pick her up from the coach station the next morning. Her voice came through the speakerphone, brisk and direct as always. I'm bringing some Yorkshire tea, some homemade jam, and some vapor rub for the baby. Are you short of anything else so I can bring it? I replied while folding clothes. We're not short of anything, Mum. Just get yourself here safely. My mum scoffed. What do you mean, not short of anything? A woman with a young baby who says she's not short of anything is only short of someone to remind. Here, I laughed, feeling my heart warm. That was my mum, the woman who could scold me from the top of the street to the bottom, but the moment I coughed, she would lose a whole night's sleep. After the call, I went into the spare room to finish tidying the wardrobe. In the bottom drawer, Margaret's thin blanket was still folded perfectly in a clear plastic bag. I remembered when she first moved in, she brought that blanket, saying she was used to the smell and it helped her sleep. Over the past 2 years, she used it in the winter and folded it into a backrest cushion in the summer. When sitting and watching her granddaughter, I picked up the blanket. A very faint smell of old washing powder lingered on it. A scent I used to find so ordinary I never paid attention to it. To make room for my own mother's things, I pushed the blanket deep into the back of the wardrobe and shut the door. The wardrobe door closed with a dry clack. I didn't know it then, but exactly 18 days later, that very same blanket would make me collapse onto the edge of the bed, hugging it to my chest and crying. Like a child. But humans, when they are being spoiled by life, rarely realize whose efforts they are standing upon. I was no different. I looked at the cleaned room, thinking that tomorrow, when my mum arrived, everything would be fine. Out in the living room, Mark was still pacing back and forth with Daisy. The baby was dozing off on her dad's shoulder, but occasionally she would startle and utter a garbled sound that sounded a lot like Gran. Mark had his back to me, his voice low, as if speaking to the baby but also to himself. Gran just went home for a bit. Be a good girl, and Gran will come back. Standing behind the bedroom door, I heard that sentence and felt a slight lump in my throat. But it was only a slight lump, not enough for me to step out and tell my husband that maybe we should ask his mother to return. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual to pick my mum up from the coach station. The kitchen was freezing because there was no bubbling pot of porridge, no small plate of toast set neatly beside a soft-boiled egg like every other day. On the table were just 2 slices of bread I'd toasted in a rush, a cold glass of milk, and the humming sound of the washing machine on the balcony. I took a bite of the dry toast, looking at Mark as he clumsily changed Daisy's nappy so clumsily that the tabs were completely misaligned, and I suddenly found it a bit funny. Mark looked up, caught my eye, and frowned. What are you laughing at? I walked over to help him fix it and replied, without your mum here, you're just now realizing nappies have a left and a right side, aren't you? Mark smiled too, but it was a tired smile. He said, without my mum here, I reckon I have a lot more to learn. At the time, I thought it was just a morning joke. I never expected it to be a foreshadowing of the storms to come. I still remember very clearly the day my mother-in-law came to the city. It was a scorching hot day in June, when I was over 7 months pregnant. She stepped off the coach with her old canvas bag, carrying an extra sack of potatoes, some fresh runner beans, and a punnet of ripe strawberries from her village. As soon as she entered the flat, she didn't sit down to rest. She took a lap around the kitchen, the balcony, and the fridge, then rolled up her sleeves and said, You, two work all day. With the house like this, the dust will get right into the baby's lungs. I was still smiling and saying, Mum, just sit down and have a glass of water first. But before I could even finish making a cup of tea, she had taken off her slippers and was standing on a chair, wiping down the ceiling fan blades. When I came home from work that afternoon, I didn't recognize my own flat. The balcony, which used to be piled with cardboard boxes, rags, and a few dead, potted plants, had been cleared out by her. She scrubbed every iron railing until it shone. The kitchen no longer smelled of old grease. The sink had no yellow residue. The fridge had been sorted into distinct compartments with separate containers, raw food, cooked food, veg, fruit, and snacks for the blank.com. Pregnant lady. Even the bathroom, which I always promised to deep clean on the weekend, but was always too tired to actually do, smelled of pine disinfectant and the lemon peels she boiled to eliminate odors. Mark just laughed back then. My mum's like that. She can't sit still. Hearing my husband, I felt a mix of embarrassment and joy. What newlywed heavily pregnant woman wouldn't want a mother-in-law who doted on her? I used to boast to my colleagues that I was lucky to have a mother-in-law who didn't nitpick, didn't demand her daughter-in-law serve her, and cooked better than most restaurants. The head accountant, upon hearing this, warned me, "If you're lucky, you need to know how to preserve it. Don't let the good person beside you become the one who always gets the short end of the stick." I nodded along at the time, but that advice drifted past me as lightly as the wind outside the window. Margaret woke up at 5:30 every morning. I wouldn't drag myself out of bed until 6:40. By then, the table would already be set with berry porridge, soft-boiled eggs, and some toast. On days we fancied a change, there would be bacon buddies from the local cafe or pastries she baked herself. She didn't eat with us right away. She usually wiped the kitchen counters while reminding me, "Eat slowly, Hannah. You're pregnant, don't rush. Mark, fetch your wife a glass of warm water, son." Mark, often still half asleep with his eyes glued to his phone, would stand up and do it when his mother told him to. When I finished and put my bowl down, she would already have a Tupperware lunchbox ready. I made extra chicken and roasted veg. Don't eat too much takeaway food at lunch. At first, I felt guilty. A few times I tried to wash the dishes, but she snatched them away. "Leave it. With a belly that big, standing too long will hurt your back. Let me do it quickly." I would stand beside her for a moment, feeling like I was in the way, then retreat to the living room to get ready for work. From guilt, it became a habit. From a habit, it became an expectation. After Daisy was born, that expectation grew even larger. When the baby cried at night, she was the first to bolt upright. I would still be groggy, wincing from the founder, pain of my stitches, only to see her pacing back and forth with her granddaughter, hushing her softly. "Go to sleep, little one. Let your mummy rest. Your mummy is very tired." Once, waking up in the middle of the night, I saw her silhouette sitting on the wedding edge of the bed, holding Daisy with one hand and rubbing her back with the other. The dim yellow nightlight cast a glow on her graying hair. Her eyes had dark circles, yet she looked at the baby with absolute tenderness. I asked Mum, "Haven't you slept?" She smiled softly. "I slept, but then I woke up. Babies have their own rhythms. You just lie down, you'll need to feed her in the morning." Hearing that, I pulled the duvet up and lay back down. People often say you only understand your mother's hardships once you become a mother yourself, but it took me a very long time to understand that in that room I wasn't the only one being a mother. My mother-in-law was being a mother all over again, only this time she did it in silence. Money was something I thought I was very fair about. Every month on payday, I would give her £300, saying it was for the grocery shopping. She would accept it, fold it carefully, and put it in her old fabric purse. But I only found out later that most of that money stayed untouched in her drawer. She bought meat and veg using her own £300 state pension. When the energy and water bills came, she rushed to pay them. If she saw baby clothes on sale, she would buy them out of her own pocket. Even when I ordered office clothes online, she would secretly slip a £20 note into my bag and say, "You need to look smart for work. Don't besting." If I felt awkward and tried to give it back, she would genuinely get upset, the kind of upset where she wouldn't raise her voice, but would just turn away and wipe the table for a very long time. Once, I told her, "Mum, keep your money for yourself. We can still work." She was preparing green beans, and her hands stopped, a few young beans dropping into the colander. She said, "What do I spend money on, love? Back in the village, I only eat a bowl of soup and some bread. Coming down here, seeing you two paying a mortgage and raising a baby. If I can't help a lot, I can at least help a little." I smiled it off, thinking old people were just like that, they love their kids. So they're frugal. It wasn't until I opened her purse to get her NHS card for a GP appointment that I saw a few crisp fivers, an old photo of Mark as a boy, and a piece of paper listing her monthly expenses. Below the line of grocery money, I Theriantand 43. Gave her, she had written in very tiny letters, "Do not take much from Hannah. Care for Daisy." She was so meticulous that sometimes I found it annoying. After a bath, every crease on the baby's neck and arms had to be dried perfectly. She applied unscented lotion. She used one type of nappy for the day and a different one for the night, The baby's clothes had to be washed separately with non-bio detergent, hung out in the sun in a specific spot, and stored in a drawer with moisture absorbers. I once teased her that she cared for her granddaughter like a princess. She just folded a tiny shirt and replied, "Babies can't speak. When they're uncomfortable, all they can do is cry. We just need to be a bit careful, so they don't suffer." Those words were so ordinary that I heard them and forgot them. Instantly. Later on, when my child was burning up with a fever in my arms, I would remember every single syllable. She didn't just look after her granddaughter. Mark was also looked after like an overgrown child. When he came home from work, his slippers were waiting by the Wanamaizetti door, hot food was on the table, and any dirty shirts thrown in the basket would be clean and hung on the balcony by the next day. She knew Mark liked his gravy thick, his cottage pie with extra cheese, and his morning coffee black but with ice. The more he was cared for, the lazier Mark became. One day, I reminded him to take out the heavy recycling bin. Before he even stood up, she waved her hand. "Leave it to me, it's heavy." Mark gave me a saved by the bell smile and went back to scrolling on his phone. I should have told my husband off, but since I was also being saved from chores every single day, I had no right to act superior. During those 2 years, Margaret barely bought anything for herself. In winter, the sleeves of her cardigan were frayed. I told her we'd take her to the place shopping center on the weekend to buy a new coat. She pulled her sleeves inward and smiled. "I only wear it around the flat. Who's going to see? Save the money." For Daisy's formula. I intended to order something online for her, but then work piled up, the baby had a teething fever, end-of-month reports loomed, and the thought just drifted away. A very small thing, but the tragedy of life is that we often forget the small things others do for us, while expecting them to remember every small thing about us. She rarely mentioned missing her village, save for late afternoons. After feeding Daisy, she would hold her granddaughter on the balcony, looking down at the communal garden of the estate, where a small rose bush grew by the path. She said there was a rose bush just like it in her garden back home, blooming bright. Red in the summer, Mark's late father used to sit under it and drink his tea. I asked, "Do you miss home, Mum?" She shook her head. "I do, but being here with my granddaughter makes me happier." Daisy had a plastic teething ring in her mouth and was beaming, and Margaret bent down to kiss her hair. Standing in the kitchen, drinking water, I looked at that scene and felt completely at ease. With Mum here, I don't have to worry. The phrase "I don't have to worry" is truly terrifying. It made me forget that my peace of mind was bought with someone else's fragmented sleep, with hasty meals eaten standing by the cooker, with the meager pension she secretly used to subsidize our groceries. It made Mark forget that his mother wasn't a pre-programmed machine in our home, ready with a hot meal whenever the door opened, ready to hold the baby whenever she cried. It made both of us live in a clean flat, smelling of hot stew and sun-dried laundry, without ever asking the person keeping it clean if she was exhausted. The day before my own mother arrived, Margaret sat on the sofa for a very long time. The BBC News was on, but her eyes weren't watching the screen. Daisy crawled around her legs, occasionally pulling on her trousers to stand up. Margaret instinctively bent down to support her. I was checking texts from my mum and noticing how quiet Margaret was. I asked, "What's wrong, Mum? Have you got a headache?" She startled and offered a faint smile. "No, I just miss the village a bit. It's been a while since I went back to put flowers on Mark's dad's grave." Hearing that, I felt relieved because it was a perfectly reasonable and timely excuse. I immediately said, "Then you should go back for a few days to rest." "Mum, my mum is coming, so I'll have someone to help out." She looked at me for a fleeting moment. Her eyes weren't obviously sad, but they weren't happy either. Then she nodded. "Right, I'll go back for a few days." Mark was bathing Daisy in the bathroom at the time. The sound of running water drowned out our conversation. I don't know if he had heard it sooner. Would he have asked his mother to stay? Or would he, like me, have thought it was a highly logical arrangement? The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. When I came out, the cooker already had a pot of porridge, minced meat, and containers of snacks ready. Veg had been washed and divided into small bags. On the fridge, she had stuck a piece of paper detailing Daisy's feeding schedule, vitamin times, the GP's phone number, and exactly where the thermometer was kept. I looked at the piece of paper and blurted out a laugh. Mum, you're acting like I don't know anything. She was washing her enamel mug. Hearing that, she just replied, I wrote it down, so it's easier to remember, not because you don't know. Her words were so soft that I couldn't perceive how much endurance lay beneath them. It wasn't until she packed her bags that I noticed how strangely little she was taking. 2 sets of loungewear, a pair of black trousers, old slippers, her enamel mug, and a bag of joint pain tablets. I asked, Do you have any other clothes, Mum? Why so little? She smiled. What else do I have? Wearing the same? Few outfits around the house is plenty. Standing beside her, holding the bag, I suddenly felt awkward. Living in our home for 2 years, she had filled every wardrobe with her children's and grandchild's belongings, while her own existence fit into a single canvas bag. At that moment, I should have understood, but I simply thought my mother-in-law was a simple woman, as old people often are. I even carefully reminded her to pack her medication, her bus pass, and her phone charger. She nodded at every last item. Yet, before walking out the door, she turned back to check if the gas was off, if Daisy's water bottle was full, and if the baby's clothes hanging on the gutter balcony were going to get caught in the rain. The person leaving the house cared more for it than the person staying behind. Yet I still felt no shame. The afternoon she left, the flat was as spotless as if it had been given a final, deep clean. The pot of porridge in the kitchen was still warm. Daisy's sterilized bottles were lined up neatly. The floors smelled of pine floor. Cleaner. Everything was so orderly that it blinded me, making me think I could continue living as effortlessly as before. I didn't know that this tidiness was just the last remnant of my mother-in-law's presence. When it ran out, the chaos that she had silently blocked at the door would flood in. It wouldn't be loud, but it would be enough to make the whole household capsize. My biological mother arrived the following afternoon. Before leaving for the Fixtered Ilozen Ilurti coach station, I even opened the fridge, looked at the containers Margaret had prepped, and confidently thought the first few days would be a breeze. She had left porridge, soup, veg, meat, even tiny details like spring onions chopped and placed in a Tupperware. All I had to do was heat them up, set the table, and welcome my mum with a decent meal. At that moment, I was still standing in Margaret's shadow without even knowing it. My mother's coach arrived later than expected. Susan stepped down with 2 massive carrier bags, her hair tied in a low bun, wearing a thick, zipped-up raincoat. As soon as she saw me, she scowled. Why are you so skinny? What on earth is your husband's family feeding you? I laughed, taking the bags from her. I've always been this weight, Mum. She eyed me up and down and clicked her tongue. A woman with a young baby who doesn't look after her health is a fool. I've come for a few days to see exactly how you're living in that house. Hearing my mum speak, I felt both amused and warmed. Having my own mother by my side, I thought I would be able to breathe much easier. I never expected that. During our very first meal, I would start missing the soft scuff of my Priesen's lash of Lashen, mother-in-law's fabric slippers in the kitchen. As soon as she entered the flat, my mum dropped her 2 huge bags in the middle of the living room. Her eyes swept across the room, from the shoe rack to the sofa to the dining table, like an inspector evaluating a building site she didn't trust. Daisy was sitting in her playpen with a stuffed toy. Seeing a prostex stranger, her eyes widened. She didn't cry yet, but her mouth trembled slightly. My mum bent down to pick her up, but before she even cooed at her, she frowned. Why are her cheeks so dry? Are you not putting cream on her? I froze for a few seconds. Daisy's lotion had run out the day before. I had meant to order some online that evening, but forgot because normally my mother-in-law kept track of all that. Margaret always had a small box for her. Granddaughter's essentials: moisturizer, saline drops, vapor rub, nail clippers, a thermometer, and gauze wipes. That box sat in the second drawer of the bedroom cabinet, and every item had its specific place. I used to open it, grab something randomly, and shove it back, leaving Margaret to tidy up after me. Now, interrogated by my own mother, I just offered a forced smile. The weather's been a bit dry lately. I'll buy some tonight. My mum looked at me like a teacher looking at a student who hadn't done their homework. A baby's face doesn't dry out for no reason. Her mother needs to pay attention. Don't think just because you have a mother-in-law looking after her, you don't need to know anything. Her words were light, but they hit exactly where I was trying to dodge. I quickly took Daisy from my mum's arms and changed the subject. You must be tired from the journey, Mum. Go wash your face. Dinner is almost ready. Susan didn't say any more, but her heavy sigh dragged a tense shadow into the ration room. I had prepared that meal since the morning. Baked salmon, garlic prawns, chicken, stew, and a side of green beans with gravy. Half the ingredients I had bought. The other half Margaret had prepped before leaving. The veg was washed, the chicken portioned, the fish descaled and placed in a container lined with paper, towels. All I had to do was cook, yet standing in the kitchen, I was sweating profusely. The stew was initially bland, but when I added salt, it became too salty. The salmon was slightly overcooked, and the prawns weren't properly marinated before the sauce dried up. I looked at the spread, reassuring myself that at least it was plentiful. Mark arrived home just as I was setting the table. Seeing his mother-in-law, he greeted her politely and placed a bag of fruit on the table. I bought some. Apples, Susan. Thought you might like them. My mum accepted them but just gave a curt nod without much of a smile. She was always like that, reserved with outsiders and keeping an even greater distance from her son-in-law. Afraid Mark might feel slighted, I rushed to say, "Go wash your hands and let's eat. There's chicken stew today, your favorite, Mum." Mark looked at me, probably sensing my tension, and nodded, heading into the kitchen to grab another pair of forks. The first dinner had 3 adults and a baby sitting in a high chair. At a glance, it should have been a cozy scene. A mother visiting her daughter, a polite son-in-law, a granddaughter gnawing on a boiled carrot. On the balcony, the laundry smelled of sunshine, but the atmosphere at the table was as fragile as a sheet of glass. Everyone holding their cutlery was afraid that a sudden movement would shatter it. My mum took a bite of the salmon, chewed a couple of times, placed her fork down and said flatly, "The salmon's overdone, lost all its sweetness." My hand, holding the serving spoon for the stew, stopped midair. Mark kept his head down, eating as if he hadn't heard. My mum then picked up a prawn, inspected the meat inside, and continued, "These prawns aren't very fresh. They go mushy when you cook them. The ones I buy at the local market back home are miles better." I smiled awkwardly. "I got them from the Tesco Express nearby. They were probably sitting in the fridge for a while." She tasted a spoonful of the stew and clicked her tongue. "This chicken stew is far too rich. A woman who's recently given birth eating like this will feel sick. You clearly don't pay any attention to how you cook." If anyone else had said that, I would have been visibly annoyed. But this was my biological mother. The woman who had fed me chicken soup when I was feverish, who had stayed up all night sewing my costume for the school play, who had argued with the neighbors just because they said attending a normal, comprehensive school meant I would amount to nothing. With my mum, I possessed a bizarre tolerance. I loved her, feared her, and got annoyed by her. Yet I could never bear to talk back. I simply replied, "Just eat what you can, Mum." I was busy all morning, so I didn't cook it perfectly. Susan put her bowl down and looked straight at me. "I didn't come here to eat gourmet meals. I came here to see how you look after your child in your home." A woman with a husband and a baby who can't even maintain a proper kitchen is going to suffer later on. Hearing that, Mark's fork paused. I could clearly see his fingers tightening around his plate, but he stayed silent. This man was never good at arguing, let alone wanting a confrontation with his mother-in-law on her first day. He just put a piece of veg on my plate, a silent reminder to stay calm. Daisy, sitting beside us, suddenly threw her piece of carrot onto the floor. My mum immediately turned to her. "Look at that. How are you raising her to be so naughty? When you change her nappy, do you wipe her with warm water first? When you feed her, don't hold your phone at the same time. Babies understand everything. If the mother isn't focused, the child acts up." Her points weren't wrong. They were so right that I couldn't argue. But my mother's tone was like a series of tiny, sharp knives, cutting into the fragile, a pride of a young mother trying to prove she had everything under control. I bent down to pick up the carrot and wiped the floor with a tissue. In that moment, the image of Margaret flashed vividly in my mind. If it were my mother-in-law, she wouldn't have asked, "How are you raising her?" She would have quietly fetched a warm cloth to wipe Daisy's hands and gently reminded me, "Next time, let's cut it a bit smaller. It'll be easier for her to hold. Same. Situation, same intention, but a different way of speaking could make the Prusli of Lus listener feel either supported or condemned. I was beginning to understand, but I still tried to defend my own mother in my heart. My mum is blunt, but she loves me, I told myself. After dinner, Mark stood up to clear the plates. My mum looked at him and said, something that sounded like a joke but wasn't pleasant to hear. Leave that for Hannah. Men should rest after a day of work, but women shouldn't be too lazy. Either. If you have a mother-in-law doing everything for you, you'll just get used to showing your face and doing nothing. Mark's face darkened instantly so fast that if I weren't his wife, I probably wouldn't have noticed. He still carried the stack of plates to the kitchen and replied politely, "It's fine, Susan. I can help out." Susan gave a dry laugh. Helping out for a few days is all well and good, but how many men keep it up? I rushed after Mark, grabbing the plates from him. "Let me wash up. You go and hold Daisy." Mark didn't hand them over immediately. He looked at me, his voice very low. "Does your mum always speak like this?" The question wasn't harsh, but it made my face burn. I whispered back, "She's always been straightforward her whole life. Please don't take it to heart." Mark glanced towards the living room, where my mum had turned the TV volume up, quite high, peeling an apple while she watched. Then he said, being straightforward is different from making people uncomfortable, Hannah. I bit my lip. Just then my mum called out, "What are you two whispering about?" "In the kitchen? Tell me if there's an issue." Mark went dead silent, set the plates down, and walked out to pick up his Barius. "Daughter." The sink quickly filled with dishes. Salmon stuck with garlic, a greasy stew, pot, a prawn pan with caked-on sauce. I rolled up my sleeves, washing up while listening to the blaring TV in the living room, mingled with my mum's voice, instructing Mark on how to hold Daisy. "Don't hold her like that, her back's curved. Support her bottom. See? Men are so clumsy with babies." Mark didn't reply. His silence then was different from his usual quietness. It was thicker, heavier, like a lid placed over the entire flat. Washing up and wiping down the kitchen took me nearly an hour. Previously, Margaret would have it done in a flash. The counters would be dry, the cloths hung in their exact spots, the rubbish tied neatly by the door, ready to be taken out. I searched endlessly for new bin liners, opened 3 drawers, and finally found them under the sink next to a pre-mixed spray bottle of floor cleaner. On the bottle was a sticky note. "Floor cleaner for the evening. Add half a cup of water." That handwriting choked me up again. She was gone, but the house was still full of her reminders. It's just that before, I never bothered to read them. That night, my mum sat in the living room watching a health program, providing a running commentary. "The doctor's right. Babies need sunlight. Women shouldn't eat rubbish after giving birth. Men in the house need to know how to love their wives." Hearing that last sentence, I instinctively looked at Mark. He was sitting on the rug playing with Daisy, his back to my mum. The corner of his mouth twitched. Upward, slightly unclear if it was a smile or sheer exhaustion. Daisy crawled over and pulled his hair. He pretended to cry out in pain, and the little girl giggled heartily. Her laughter softened the room for a few seconds, but only for a few seconds. When it was time for bed, my mum went into her room, which had already been prepped, and opened the wardrobe to unpack. Seeing the wardrobe half empty, she called out, "Did your mother-in-law sleep in this room before?" I was changing Daisy's top and replied, "Yes, Mark's mum stayed here for 2 years." She went quiet for a moment, then shouted back in a displeased tone, "Stayed that long? So is this flat yours and your husband's, or is it hers?" I froze. The sentence wasn't loud, but it felt like a piece of grit in a mouthful of rice. I wanted to say, "My mother-in-law was helping us, don't think." Like that. But my mum had already shut the wardrobe door. The sharp clack cut off any words I had. That night, Daisy struggled to sleep. Maybe it was the unfamiliar scent of her grandmother, or maybe she missed the lullabies from her gran. She tossed and turned constantly, whimpering and crying. I picked her up to soothe her, but the more I rocked her, the more my arms ached. Mark was about to help when my mum stepped out of the spare room, her hair down, looking grumpy from being woken. "Up," she said. "Give her here, let me hold her. You're holding her so anxiously. How is she supposed to sleep?" I handed the baby over, but the moment Daisy was in her arms, She cried even. Louder, kicking her legs wildly. My mum flushed red, awkwardly patting her. Granddaughter's back while trying to justify it. She's just used to your smell, so she's acting up. Give it a few days, she'll be fine. Watching my mum hold the baby more clumsily than I expected, I unexpectedly felt a wave of pity. My mother had raised 3 children. She had managed a house, a garden, grocery shopping, and illnesses all on her own. Yet now, facing a baby, not even a year old, she was fumbling. Time spares no one. The mother who used to carry me through the rain to the clinic now had veiny hands, and her wrists trembled slightly as she supported her grandchild's back. But feeling pity is one thing, feeling exhausted is another. The sound of Daisy crying, my mum's grumbling, Mark's heavy sighs, they all mixed together, making me want to burst into tears. It was nearly midnight by the time the baby settled. Mark laid a thin blanket out on the sofa and told me to go to the bedroom and rest. I'll sleep out here and keep watch in case she wakes up. I asked, why don't you come to bed? He glanced at my mum's slightly ajar door and replied, I'm worried that if she cries in the night, your mum will be kept awake. The excuse sounded perfectly logical, but I knew it wasn't the whole truth. He was avoiding her, avoiding the TV noise, avoiding the criticisms, avoiding the feeling of having to tiptoe and whisper in his own home in a completely new way. When my mother-in-law lived here, she also tiptoed and whispered, but that was so we could sleep. Now, the ones tiptoeing and whispering were my husband and I. The next morning, my mum was up at 6 a.m. She didn't go straight to the kitchen. Instead, she went out to the balcony to do her morning Pilates, playing music on her phone quite loudly. Normally at that hour, Margaret would have already finished cooking porridge, but her footsteps were so light that many days I didn't even know what time she woke up. But the sound of my mum's music echoed through the cracks in the doors, waking both Mark and Daisy. The baby scrunched up her face and wailed. Mark sat up holding his head, his hair a mess. I picked the baby up and walked out, intending to ask my mum to turn it down, but she turned around and spoke first. Waking up early is good. For your health. Sleeping in and then complaining you're tired, honestly. Mark looked at me, I looked at my mum. Neither of us said another word. On the 3rd day of my mum's stay, I got home from work later than usual. As soon as I opened the door, the smell of burnt onions wafted from the kitchen. Mark was standing in front of the frying pan, a spatula in hand, stirring veg, with a face as tense as if he were filing a technical report. My mum was sitting on the sofa watching TV, one hand massaging her back. Seeing me, she said, Why? Are you so late today? My back is killing me, so I told Mark to throw a meal together. Men should know how to do housework too. In theory, she wasn't wrong. But looking at Mark, still in his work shirt, his back soaked with sweat, while my mum sat calmly criticizing the boring TV schedule, I suddenly felt my face grow hot. I ran into the kitchen. Let me do it. Mark shook his head, his voice dry. It's almost done. Dinner that evening consisted of a burnt shepherd's pie and overboiled, mushy, and veg. My mum tasted a spoonful of the pie and put her fork down. Too salty. She picked up some veg and continued. Overcooked. Looking at the pie crust, she frowned. Heat was too high, it's burnt. Mark kept his head down and ate without reacting, but his jaw clenched tight. I couldn't hold it in any longer. My voice came out quiet but sharp. Mum, can you please stop complaining? He's been at work all day and he still came back. And cooked. Susan slammed her fork down on the table. Little Daisy startled, dropping a tiny piece of mashed potato from her mouth onto her bib. My mum looked at me, her eyes red with anger. I raised you for all these years and now you defend your husband and talk back to me? Was anything I said wrong? If it's awful, I'll say, it's awful. Should I be praising him? The dining table fell dead silent. Mark put his plate down, lifted Daisy out of her high chair, and patted her back as she started to wail loudly. I sat rigidly on my chair, my ears ringing. Amidst my daughter's cries, my mind suddenly flashed to Margaret. In the past 2 years, she had never slammed her cutlery down in front of her grandchild. She had never criticized me in front of Mark, and she had never turned a family meal into a tribunal. There were days when I let something thoughtless slip out, and she would just quietly step out onto the balcony to water the plants. I used to find her silence comfortable, because it didn't force me to confront anything. Thinking back now, she must. I've swallowed so much resentment on so many occasions. After dinner, Mark soothed Daisy to sleep, then spent a long time in the bathroom. My mum was still angry, sitting in the living room muttering to herself. Daughters grow up and say one word and they take offense. They don't love their own mothers. They only care about outsiders. I washed the dishes in the kitchen. The hot water ran over my hands, but I still felt freezing cold. The outsider my mum mentioned was my husband, my mother-in-law, the people who were currently living with me in this flat. Meanwhile, the person sharing my blood was making me feel completely trapped. That night, Mark didn't say much. He just said, "I'm not angry at your mum, but I'm exhausted." Just one word, exhausted, and it sounded heavier than any reproach. I sat next to him on the sofa, wanting to apologize but not knowing where to begin. Apologize because my mum criticized him? Because I used to think it was perfectly normal for his mum to do everything? Or because it took me until now to realize that this flat wasn't peaceful because it was naturally peaceful, but because someone was always stepping ahead of the collisions to absorb the impact? Out on the balcony, the potted plants Margaret had cared for were still green. I went out to water them, but didn't know which one needed a lot of water and which one just needed a light misting on the leaves. The watering can in my hand splashed soil everywhere, and water pooled on the floor. Mark stood behind me, watched for a while, and then said, "My mum watered those plants for 2 years. I bet you never once asked her how to do it, did you?" I turned around, intending to argue, but his eyes held no sarcasm. They were just deeply sad. That sadness silenced me. I grabbed a cloth to mop up the water on the floor, and a very small crack began to form in my heart. The crack wasn't big enough to bring everything crashing down, but it was enough to let the light in, illuminating the things I had previously chosen to ignore. I had thought my mother-in-law leaving was simply a change of staff. I had thought that when my biological mother arrived, I would be loved in a much more comfortable way. I had thought that housework, childcare, and keeping the family peace were natural occurrences that someone would just handle. But after just 3 days, the kitchen had a new chef. The meals tasted different. Mark's laughter had faded. And deep down, though I didn't dare say it out loud, I was beginning to miss my mother-in-law. Not like missing a skilled housekeeper, but missing the piece of peace I used to have but never knew how to be grateful for. By the 4th day of my mum's stay, I came home late because of an end-of-month stock check at work. As soon as I opened the door, a sour smell of unwashed baby muslins hit me, mixed with the smell of cold cooking oil and formula spilt on the rug. The living room wasn't horrifically messy, but everything had shifted from its usual place. Unfolded baby clothes lay on the armrest of the sofa. Half-empty water glasses were scattered on the coffee table. An open pack of nappies sat right next to the TV remote. And Daisy's toys had rolled all the way to the kitchen door. My mum sat on the sofa, her feet up on a small stool, watching a soap opera, while rubbing her back. Seeing me, she immediately said, "Why are you back so late today?" "My back is killing me. I haven't had time to tidy anything up." Before I could reply, a loud clatter of pans echoed from the kitchen. Mark was in there, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, his tie slung over the back of a chair. He was holding his phone in one hand to read a recipe, while the other furiously stirred a pot of stew that was bubbling over. The steam fogged up his glasses, making him look both comical and pitiful. Seeing me standing at the kitchen door, he glanced over, trying to sound normal. "Go have a shower. Dinner's almost ready." That almost dragged out into a salty stew, a plate of yellowing over-fried veg, and some burnt sausages. But in that situation, I was in no mood to complain about anything. Dinner that night was even quieter than the previous ones. My mum tasted a piece of sausage, her eyebrows knitting together out of habit. But perhaps remembering the incident from the day before, she delivered a slightly milder verdict. Heat was too high, it's a bit dry. Mark kept his head down, eating his food without a word. Daisy sat in her high chair, banging her plastic spoon against the table, occasionally looking at the adults as if guessing when someone was going to explode. The whole flat felt like a tightly sealed pressure cooker, boiling underneath, while the surface remained artificially still. I looked at my husband and suddenly found him unfamiliar. Before, when Mark came home, he would usually collapse onto the sofa and shout, "What's for dinner?" "Mum?" Margaret would pop her head out of the kitchen and scold him lovingly. "Go. Wash your hands and then eat. You're a grown man asking like a child." That scolding was as light as a caress. And Mark would laugh, go wash his hands, and sit down at the table with the absolute peace of a man who knows he always has a place to return to. Now it was the same kitchen, the same dining table, but he ate as if just trying to get it over with. His shoulders hunched as if anticipating a verbal dart flying in from the living room. After eating, I proactively washed up. Mark took Daisy out to the balcony for some fresh air, while my mum sat picking her teeth, watching TV and talking. See, men need to get their hands dirty. Otherwise, they get used to their gond. Mother's waiting on them hand and foot, and the wife suffers for a lifetime. The logic seemed to be for my benefit, but to my ears, it was anything but pleasant. I wanted to say that my mother-in-law didn't wait on anyone. She looked after the house out of love, and we were the ones at fault for letting her do too much. But saying that in front of my own mother right now would be like pouring petrol on a fire. So I just bent my head and scrubbed the burnt pan, scrubbed until my fingernails ached. That night, Mark slept on the sofa again. The excuse this time was still the I fear of Daisy crying and waking my mum up. But when I brought a blanket out, he was lying facing the back of the sofa, his phone off, eyes open in the dark. I sat down next to him and whispered, "Come into the bedroom, you'll hurt your back lying here." Mark stayed silent for a moment, then replied, "It's easier to breathe out." Here. Those words froze me to the spot. A grown man saying that in his own home he had to sleep on the sofa just to breathe. It sounded both pitiful and humiliating. I pulled the blanket over his shoulders, my voice dropping even lower. "I'm sorry. My mum speaks harshly, but she doesn't mean any harm." Mark turned his face towards me. The light from the kitchen illuminated half of his exhausted face. He looked at me for a very long time before saying, "I know. Your mum loves you, Hannah. But listen to me. Just because someone loves you, it doesn't give them the right to suffocate everyone else." The sentence wasn't loud, nor was it sharp, yet it went straight into my heart. I used to think that when a biological mother spoke harshly, it was out of love. I thought a mother-in-law was only gentle because she had to keep up appearances. But if the end result of love is making the people around you feel useless and trapped, then that love needs to be re-examined. The next morning, the flat was in chaos from very early on. My mum played her morning Pilates music on the balcony. The volume wasn't excessively loud, but enough to wake Daisy. The baby wailed. Mark shot up as if he'd been electrocuted, while I frantically tried to make a bottle of formula. Looking everywhere, I couldn't find the measuring scoop. I tore through all the ladders, cabinets, finally finding it sitting inside a weaning bowl, covered by a small saucer. My mum walked in from the balcony, a sheen of sweat on her forehead, and frowned. "Everything in this house is hidden away so tightly, it's infuriating. Trying to find anything. Your mother-in-law is too particular. It makes things impossible to use." I hugged the bottle, shaking it vigorously, intending to reply but stopping myself. In the past, I too had found Margaret's organization a bit pedantic. Everything was divided into containers with dated sticky notes. Now, with everything out of place, I finally understood that her pedantry had saved me from countless moments of panic. Things are like feelings. When someone quietly puts them in their proper place, you don't feel grateful. It's only when the order is lost that you realize things don't just fall into place naturally. By day 8, Mark said he wanted to go back to Yorkshire and bring his mum down. He said it while I was hanging up Daisy's clothes, and my mum was in the greatest bedroom rocking the baby to sleep. Out on the balcony, the midday sun beat down. On the potted plants, the soil was dry because I had been watering them erratically. Mark stood beside me, holding a tiny baby shirt, his voice very soft. "Should I go and bring Mum back?" I looked at him, knowing that sentence had been brewing in his mind for days. Before he dared to speak it, I asked, "And then what? The two mums live together?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked towards the living room, where my mum was rocking the baby and simultaneously muttering complaints about the mattress being too hot, and gave a bitter laugh. Probably not a good idea. We fell silent. two mothers living together in this two-bedroom flat. One, accustomed to enduring, swallowing everything into her own heart. One who loved her child by speaking the brutal, painful truth. Without even debating who was, good or bad, the flat would become a battlefield. I loved my mom, missed my mother-in-law, and felt sorry for my husband. But I didn't know where to place everyone so that no one would get hurt. On day 10, I woke up to find Mark's blanket and pillows still on the sofa. He was sitting at the dining table, hair messy, dark circles under his eyes, a cold cup of black coffee in front of him. My mom was in the bedroom changing Daisy's clothes, her voice projecting outward. Her dad is so clumsy. Put her top on backwards. Men are truly only good for going to work. Hearing that, the corner of Mark's mouth twitched slightly. Standing at the Perienne bedroom door, I suddenly felt as if I were witnessing every string in my husband's heart being stretched to breaking point. And the person pulling them wasn't just my mom, it was me too. Because I had let this drag on. Breakfast that morning was croissants bought from the Tesco Express downstairs, and some cartons of juice. My mom took a few bites and complained the pastry was dry. That store-bought food wasn't good for the baby. She then turned her frustration on me, scolding me for not having a pot of porridge ready. I tried to swallow the pastry in my mouth, feeling it get stuck in my throat. Margaret used to wake up at 5:30 to make porridge for the whole family. But back then, I just thought old people slept less. It was only when I had to choose between waking up early to cook porridge, preparing the baby's things, rushing to clock in at work, and keeping my own mum from being offended, that I realized how priceless a peaceful morning truly was. That afternoon, I came home early from work to tidy up. As soon as I opened the Prisoners' opened door, Claire, a neighbor from the same floor, was waiting by the lift holding her toddler. Seeing me, she asked, "Has Daisy's gran gone back to the village? Hannah? I haven't seen her bringing the baby down to the communal garden for days. My little Leo keeps asking for her." I smiled awkwardly and said she'd gone back for a few days. Claire clicked her tongue. She is so lovely. Every morning I'd see her walking back from the shops with her bags, and in the afternoon she'd bring the baby down to play. It's rare to find someone like that nowadays. An outsider's words were light as air, yet they followed me right into the flat and lodged in my throat. In the living room, my mum was rummaging through the bags she brought from home, pulling out some herbal bath packets and a bottle of Vicks Vapor Rub. Seeing me, she said, "Bathe Daisy with these herbs tonight. Stop using all those live chemicals your husband's family buys." I was about to say that the baby wash was recommended by the GP, but looking at my mum's face, I stopped. She didn't know she had just touched the very items Margaret had chosen so carefully after asking the GP, asking mum groups, testing every brand so her granddaughter wouldn't break out in a rash. Two mothers, both wanting the best for the child, but one cared through quiet research, and the other cared through old habits and the absolute belief that she was always right. That night, Daisy was a bit fussy. I thought she was teething, so I gave her some water and rocked her. My mum said it might be because the bath wasn't warm enough, and insisted I put another layer of clothing on her. Mark touched the baby's forehead and said she felt a bit warm. I went to get the thermometer, but I couldn't find it. Then I remembered Margaret's note saying it was in the second drawer of the bedside table. I opened it, and the thermometer was exactly there, next to the saline drops and an unopened box of cooling gel patches. On the box, she had written in biro, "Only use if fever is high. Must go to the GP." Holding the box, my heart suddenly beat faster. The thermometer read 37.8 degrees Celsius. My mum said that was normal for babies, just wrap her in a blanket to sweat it out. Mark was uneasy, but seeing my hesitation, he didn't argue. That night, Daisy slept fitfully, her body warm, occasionally letting out a small whimper. I placed my hand on her forehead repeatedly, anxious but trying to reassure myself, "She'll be fine by moi." From the next room, my mum's place Klaus voice drifted in. "Don't panic over every little thing. I raised 3 children. A teething fever is completely normal." Hearing my mum, I tried to suppress my own fears. But ultimately, I still pulled a thin blanket over my baby's tummy. Towards morning, I finally drifted off. In A fitful dream. I saw Margaret standing on the balcony, holding a watering can, looking at the wilting potted plants without saying a word. I called out Mum. But she didn't turn around. When I jolted awake, the room was dimly lit. Daisy's hot breath was puffing against my wrist. The baby lay beside me, her cheeks flushed bright red, lips dry. Her two tiny hands were clenched into fists. I touched her forehead. My entire body went cold. On the morning of the 11th day, the thermometer jumped to 38.5 degrees Celsius. The glowing, red numbers on the tiny screen felt like a direct slap to the face. Daisy lay in, my arms burning up, her wispy hair stuck to her sweaty forehead, her eyes, half open, glazed over, then closing again. Her cries were weaker than usual. All night I had reassured myself that it was just teething, just a mild fever, that a quick sponge bath would fix it. But the moment I saw that number, all my self-reassurances collapsed completely. I bolted upright, holding my baby, and called out to Mark, who was sleeping on Laralee Blexen of left, the sofa. He practically threw himself into the room, his face groggy with sleep, but his eyes wide awake the moment he touched Daisy's forehead. My mum also stepped out, her hair uncombed, a cardigan thrown hastily over her shoulders. Watching me frantically changing the baby's clothes, she frowned. What are you in such a panic for? A baby with a 38.5 fever isn't the end of the world. Wrap her up so she sweats it out, rub some Vicks on the soles of her feet, it'll go down in a bit. I heard the phrase wrap her up and the words Margaret had written on the box flashed in my mind. If fever is high, must go to the GP. For the first time since my biological mother arrived, I didn't choose to remain silent. I held Daisy tight against my chest, my voice shaking but firm. No. I'm taking Daisy to the walk-in clinic. My mum froze, as if she couldn't believe the daughter who had just talked back to her. She followed me into the living room, her voice rising. I raised 3 children. I've looked after all the grandchildren in this family. A slight fever, and you're rushing her to the hospital for them to pump her full of las. God knows what? If you aren't going to listen to me, why did you even ask me to? Come. Mark stood beside me, holding the nappy bag and a photocopy of the baby's birth certificate, looking at me, waiting for a decision. In his eyes, there was worry, but also a hint of pleading. Don't back down anymore. I spoke very fast, afraid that if I paused for even a second, I would soften. Mum, you stay here and rest. We're taking the baby to get checked, then we'll be back. Susan went red with anger. She followed us to the door, scolding. You really are something. Married, and suddenly your own mother's words mean nothing to you. Back home, people deal with fevers like this all the time. Nobody runs to the hospital over every little thing. Don't listen to your elders. And one day, you'll regret it when it's too late. The lift doors opened. I stepped in first, Mark followed. My mum's voice still echoed down the corridor. Don't listen to me and you'll be sorry. Mark stood behind me the whole way down, but this time, I didn't turn back. The drive to the local A&E clinic was only 10 minutes, yet it felt as long as an entire morning. Mark drove, glancing constantly in the rearview mirror. I sat in, the back holding Daisy, one hand pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. She wasn't crying loudly anymore, just whimpering in her throat. That tiny sound tangled my heart into knots. Outside the car window, cafes were opening, people were buying coffees, going to work, laughing and talking just like any other day. All I could hear was my baby's hot breathing and my own heart hammering against my ribcage. The morning clinic was packed, babies crying, adults calling out numbers. The smell of antiseptic mixed with formula and sweat made me dizzy. Mark went to the Prodens reception desk, while I sat on a plastic chair holding Daisy, looking at other two parents holding their feverish, coughing, wheezing children. In the past, whenever Daisy had a slight runny nose or lost her appetite, Margaret would handle it incredibly early. Sometimes she would steam some pears, sometimes she would make a watery soup, or she would ring the health visitor she knew back. I'm home. I had never had to sit in a clinic feeling like such a clumsily, unforgivably neglectful mother. The doctor called Daisy's name. I carried her in, stuttering. She had a slight fever since last night. This morning it's 38.5. She's fussy, not feeding much. The female doctor, in her 40s, felt her neck, listened to her chest, and checked her throat. She looked up and asked, "Did you wrap her up in lots of blankets at home?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. Mark, standing behind me, answered, "Immediately, yes, we put a thin blanket on her. Her grandmother said it would help her sweat it out." The doctor sighed softly, not a harsh reprimand, but her tone was firm enough. "You absolutely must not wrap up a baby with a fever. Her throat is inflamed. Her tonsils are swollen. It's a good thing you brought her in early. Go home, keep a close eye on her, sponge her down with lukewarm water, and dress her in light, breathable clothes. If the fever spikes higher or she starts convulsing, you must bring her to A&E immediately." The words "good thing" made my arms go weak. Good thing we brought her in early. Good thing I argued with my mum. Good thing Mark didn't hesitate. I looked down at Daisy, seeing her so exhausted she didn't even have the energy to squirm when the doctor prescribed the medicine. Suddenly, tears fell onto the back of my presented baby's hand. The doctor handed me a tissue, her voice softening. "Young mothers all panic. Sometimes. But when looking after a baby, you have to follow the child's actual condition, don't just rely on old wives' tales." I nodded, my throat tight. That sentence wasn't just meant for my mum. It was meant for me too. In the waiting area for the pharmacy, Mark went to pay for the prescription, while I sat by the window holding Daisy. The morning sun filtered through the frosted glass, falling onto the tiny hand gripping my collar. That hand was hot, weak and soft. It reminded me of the nights Margaret sat by the bed, using the back of her hand to feel her granddaughter's forehead, then checking the soles of her feet, before finally feeling reassured enough to pull the blanket up to her tummy. She did everything without making a fuss, without announcing how brilliant she was, without telling me I was clumsy. She just silently stood, guard against any bad things that might happen. Once, when Daisy was 4 months old, she sneezed a bit. I said it was probably just dust. Margaret didn't say anything. She just quietly wiped down the fans. Again, changed the bed sheets, cleaned the baby's nose with saline, and cooked a pot of chicken soup for the whole family. 2 days later, the sneezing stopped, and I completely forgot about it. Thinking back now, perhaps over the past year, Daisy wasn't healthy just because of good luck, but because there was someone who always bent down to notice the tiniest symptoms. That meticulousness wasn't paraded as an achievement, so we just treated it as good fortune. Mark returned, a white paper bag of medicine in his hand. He sat down next to me, his voice hoarse. "I'm going to ring Mum, okay?" I knew he wanted to ring Margaret. If it had been a few days ago, I might have felt awkward about my own mum hearing it, or worried that my mother-in-law would think I was useless. But at that moment, all my pride lay buried beneath my daughter's 38.5 degrees Celsius temperature. I just nodded. "Call her. Put it on speaker." The phone rang for a while before Margaret picked up. Her voice on the other end was hoarser than usual, but the moment she heard Mark say Daisy had a fever, she was fully alert. "What's her temperature, son? Since what time? Is she coughing? A runny nose? How are her nappies? Is she feeding? Is her whole body hot, or just her head? What did the doctor say about her throat?" Mark answered every question. When he didn't know, he turned to ask me. Margaret listened intently. She didn't interrupt, and she didn't utter a single word of blame as to why we let her granddaughter get a fever. Finally, she spoke slowly, her voice so calm it made me want to cry. "Don't panic, you two. A baby with a throat infection and a fever will be tired, but if you monitor her properly, she'll be fine. Go home, put her in light clothes, wipe her down with lukewarm water, especially her neck, armpits, and groin. Do not wrap her up. Give her the medicine exactly when the doctor said. If the blanks bobble, fever spikes again tonight, or she becomes unresponsive, take her straight back to A&E. Don't worry about the hassle. Hannah needs to remember to drink water. If she's too tired, her milk will drop, and the baby will just get more upset." Hearing my name, I turned my face away, unable to hide my tears in time. It wasn't that she didn't know I was at fault. She probably knew everything. Knew I let her go back to the village right as my own mother arrived. Knew I had never truly learned how to meticulously care for my child. Knew the flat would descend into chaos without her. But in the moment her grandchild was ill, she didn't use that knowledge to twist the knife. She just pointed the way for me to get through the panic. There are people who are so incredibly kind that they make you feel ashamed not because of what they say, but because they choose not to say the things they have every right to say. Before hanging up, Mark asked softly, "How are you doing back home, Mum? Are you well?" Her hoarse voice paused for half a beat over the line. Then she laughed. "I'm fine. I think I was watering the garden in the wind yesterday, so my throat is a bit dry. You two focus on Daisy. I'm perfectly fine back here." That laugh tried so hard to be light, but I heard a very deep emptiness in it. A person who had lived surrounded by her grandchild's cries and laughter for 2 years, now back in a quiet village house. Even eating a meal alone must have been difficult to swallow. Yet she still claimed she was fine, afraid that showing even a hint of sadness would make us feel guilty. When we got home, Daisy's fever had dropped slightly, but she was still exhausted. My mum was waiting in the living room. Seeing us come in, she stood up to ask how it went. I said the GP diagnosed a throat infection and told us not to wrap her up. She flinched slightly, but immediately corrected herself. I meant wrap her up moderately. Who said, completely smother her? You've been to the doctor now, so you can relax. Babies bounce back quickly. Mark said nothing. He just placed the bag of medicine on the table and went to wash his hands. His silence this time wasn't him biting his tongue to keep the peace. It looked like he was simply too exhausted to argue. I took Daisy into the bedroom to change her into thinner clothes. My mum followed, and seeing me doing the opposite of what she suggested, her face darkened again. "The poor girl is ill and you're dressing her so lightly, what? If she catches a cold?" I tried to keep my voice soft. "The doctor advised it, Mum. And my mother-in-law said the same thing." The moment she heard the phrase, "my mother-in-law," Susan immediately stood upright. Her eyes sharpened not because she hated Daisy or didn't love me, but because some deep-seated vulnerability had been struck. She asked, So in the end, are you listening to the doctor, or are you listening to her?" I was too tired to beat around the bush. I answered tactlessly, "I'm listening to whoever is right." As soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I had hurt her. Susan gave a dry laugh, a laugh that was both angry and bitter. "Right. The biological mother is old-fashioned. The mother-in-law is always right. I've only been here a few days, and you're already comparing us." Holding Daisy, I didn't know where to direct my anger. Because my mum was genuinely wrong, but she was also genuinely hurt. And I, standing in the middle, holding a feverish child, felt like I was being pulled in two directions. Mark stepped in from the living room, holding a cup of warm water and the baby's medicine. He looked at my mum. His tone was still polite, but it lacked the softness it had before. "Susan, the most important thing right now is getting Daisy's fever down. Let's just follow the doctor's orders for now." My mum turned to him, her lips pressed into a tight line. Perhaps she wasn't used to a son-in-law speaking so directly to her, even though there was nothing disrespectful in his words. The atmosphere in the room grew incredibly tense. Daisy whimpered. I quickly patted her back, feeling as though this entire household was forcing a baby to bear the brunt of the adult's stubbornness. That afternoon dragged on in pure exhaustion. I set alarms for every dose of 29. Medicine sponged Daisy down, changed her clothes when she sweated, and logged her temperature on my phone. The tasks weren't overly difficult, but doing them continuously while drowning in anxiety left me completely drained. My mum sat nearby, occasionally offering input. "Sponging her like that will make her cold. You're not giving her enough water. Holding her like that, I will hurt your back." There were moments I was so frustrated I wanted to snap back. But looking at her gray hair, looking at her slightly trembling hand, holding a cloth, I swallowed it all down. Old people often refuse to admit they are wrong, because admitting they are wrong means admitting they are obsolete, that they are no longer the person their children need the most. Late that night, Daisy's temperature dropped to 37.6 degrees Celsius. She drifted off to sleep, her face less flushed, her breathing more regular. I sat by the bed, my back aching, my eyes stinging. Mark brought me a mug of hot milk and set it on the bedside table. He said softly, "Drink this. You haven't eaten properly since this morning." His action reminded me of Margaret's words over the phone. Hannah needs to remember to drink water. The person far away still remembered me. Yet, Over the person remembered me. 2 years I lived with her. How many times had I remembered her? Did she eat? Breakfast or lunch? Did her back ache? Was her state pension enough? Was she lonely in the village on her own? I had never once properly asked her those questions. Out in the living room, my mum was still watching TV, but the volume was much lower than usual. Perhaps she was also exhausted, also scared, but just didn't. I know how to step into the room and offer a gentle word. I looked through the place crack in the door and saw her bending down to rub her knee, her back slightly hunched. Instinctively, my heart softened a fraction. My mum wasn't a bad person. She loved me with a rough, outdated, thorny kind of love, but a hand full of thorns, even when reached out to help, can still make the person being like buying helped bleed. Mark sat down next to me, his phone still in his hand. He looked at the sleeping baby and said quietly, "I want to ring Mum again to tell her the fever broke." I nodded. This time, when Margaret answered, her voice seemed audibly lighter. She asked about the temperature, asked if the baby had fed, asked if she had kept the medicine down. After Mark answered, she said, "That's good. Tonight you'll have to keep watch. You two take shifts sleeping. Don't let one person stay up all night. Hannah has just gone back to work. She'll be too tired. She won't be able to cope tomorrow." I sat close to the phone, listening to every word, my eyes welling up again. My mum walked in from the living room just as Mark had yet to turn off the common A speakerphone. She stood in the doorway and heard Margaret's entire instruction. The expression on my mum's face was indescribable, a mix of wounded pride, defiance, and a hint of feeling left behind. Mark said thank you to his mum and hung up. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then my mum spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was prickly. Acting. Like she's the only one who knows how to look after a baby. I was too exhausted to beat around the bush. I placed my hand on Daisy's back, looked at my mother and said softly, "Mum, can you please just say one less thing? I've been terrified all day today." Susan froze. Perhaps in her memory, I was still the little girl who would stay quiet whenever she scolded me, who would back down whenever she was angry. This was the first time she saw me looking straight at her with red, teary eyes. She didn't continue scolding, but that silence felt heavier than any words. A long moment later, she asked, "Are you taking your mother-in-law's side or your own mother's side?" The question dropped into the room, sharp and cold. Mark looked up at me. Daisy remained asleep, her tiny hand loosely gripping the hem of my shirt. I looked at my biological mother, then at my husband, then at the child who had just survived a fever. And for the first time in my life, I understood that there are questions that cannot be answered by picking sides. If I constantly had to choose a faction between the women I called Mum, then perhaps the first person who was wrong was me, because I had allowed love to become a tug of war. I couldn't answer. That night, Daisy slept fitfully. Every hour or so, I would bolt upright to feel her forehead, check the thermometer, and log it on my phone, terrified that if I let my guard down for even a second, the fever would return and punish me again. Mark lay at the edge of the bed, his eyes red from lack of sleep, occasionally reaching out to pull the blanket down from the baby's tummy, exactly as his mother had instructed. Out in the living room, my mum wasn't sleeping either, but she didn't come in. The sound of her slippers pacing back and forth was very soft, softer than usual, as if she too was afraid that her own noise would add more tension to a flat that was already stretched to its limits. At nearly 3 a.m., I went to the kitchen for some water. The kitchen light flicked on, illuminating a pile of unwashed mugs, a box of medicine placed next to a bag of nappies, and the baby's sponge bath towel draped hastily over a chair. Everything was so messy. If it had been before, Margaret would have cleaned it all up ages ago and left a warm glass of water waiting for me on the Feimestade table. Standing in front of the tap, I suddenly remembered how hoarse my Aber's mother-in-law's voice had been on the phone. A woman who had returned to her village, staying in an empty, quiet house, yet upon hearing her grandchild had a fever, asked about every single detail without missing a beat. And me? Daughter-in-law who had lived with her for 2 years. Even when her voice was propensather bindingly, completely raspy, I just asked a token, "Are you okay, Mum?" And let the call drift on because I was too busy worrying about my own problems. The next morning, Daisy's fever had significantly reduced. She was still tired, but had managed a few sips of milk, kept her eyes open longer, and was able to grip my finger. The whole household breathed a sigh of relief. The only thing that hadn't cooled down was the atmosphere between the three adults. Mark took the morning off work to stay home and look after the baby with me. My mum quietly went into the kitchen and made a pot of plain porridge. She didn't criticize, she didn't give orders. She just occasionally coughed dryly and lifted the lid to check if the rice had softened. Her silence made me uncomfortable in a completely different way. I was used to her talking a lot, used to her snapping, used to her making me annoyed. When she didn't say anything, I felt like an ungrateful child who had just deeply hurt her mother. At lunchtime, after giving Daisy her medicine, Mark sat on the balcony making a stoat call to his workplace. His voice was low, tired, and polite. I watched my husband through the glass door, noticing how much thinner his shoulders looked after less than half a month. The shirt he was wearing was wrinkled at the elbows, the collar had a dried milk stain, and his chin was stubbly because he hadn't shaved properly in days. In the past, every morning Margaret would have a freshly ironed shirt waiting for him on the chair by the bed, and a cup of black coffee waiting at the black toffee. Perfect temperature when he stepped out of the bedroom. I used to tease him that his mother spoiled him too much, but I myself was enjoying that same spoiling, sitting there judging like an outsider. On the afternoon of the 15th day, after Daisy had regained enough energy to play a little, I took my phone out to the hallway corridor to call Margaret. For some reason, I didn't dare call her in front of my own mum. That sneaking around made me feel both ridiculous and ashamed, as if checking on my mother-in-law was somehow a betrayal of my own mother. The phone rang for a long time before she answered. The faint sound of chickens clucking came through, the rustle of wind over the speaker, and then her voice. "Hannah, how is Daisy, love? Did her fever spike again last night?" I leaned against the wall, looking down the long, hollow corridor of the flats, and replied softly. "Her fever broke, Mum. The GP said to keep monitoring her, but I think she's okay." I rang to ask, "When are you coming back down?" As soon as the last sentence left my mouth, I felt my face flush hot. Just a few days ago, I was thinking it was fine for her to go back to the village for a rest. Yet here I was, desperate for her to return like a drowning person, desperate for the shore. Margaret went quiet for so long that I could clearly hear her raspy bloat. Breathing. Finally, she spoke very gently. "Wait until your mum goes home, then I'll come down, the two of us living together. It'll make things difficult for you." I quickly said, "It won't be difficult, Mum. Just come back. Daisy misses you." She laughed, but the laugh cracked at the end. "Babies only miss a scent for a day. Few days, then they get used to it. Me coming down now isn't right. Your mum is there to help with the baby. Why should I intrude?" Her words were considerate, as always. But in that word intrude, there was a plain, very thin streak of sorrow. It choked me. It turned out the person who had lived in her son's home for 2 years still feared she was an intruder. It turned out that canvas bag by the lift doors wasn't a casual trip back to the village. It was her way of removing herself from the place where she used to quietly stand. I asked, "Have you caught a cold, Mum? Your voice is so hoarse." She replied instantly, "No, I'm absolutely fine. I was just sweeping the patio. Yesterday, the dust made my throat dry. Don't worry about me, worry about Daisu." That I'm absolutely fine from the elderly is sometimes like a lid forced onto a boiling pot of water. They say they're fine because they are afraid of bothering their children, afraid of becoming a burden, afraid that if they show even a sliver of vulnerability, someone else will be forced to make a choice. I wanted to tell her, "Mum, don't be like that anymore. If you're sad, say you're sad. If you're tired, say you're tired." But my throat was completely blocked. In the end, all I could manage was a very bland instruction. "Drink some warm water, Mum. If you get a fever, please go to the GP." As soon as I hung up, I turned around and saw my own mum standing behind me. I didn't know how long she had been there. Susan was holding a tea towel, her eyes a few degrees colder. The corridor was empty, save for the hum of the lift and the smell of the estate's floor cleaner. My mum looked at me and asked directly, "Calling your mother-in-law?" I nodded. She gave a dry laugh. "The baby's fever has barely broken and you're already calling to invite her back. You really are used to being waited on hand and foot Without someone to serve you, you can't cope. That sentence poured petrol on the shame I was already trying to swallow. I tried to keep my composure. Mom, I was just calling to see how she is. Please, don't talk like that. Susan stepped back into the flat, slammed the tea towel onto the dining table, her voice not loud, but every word was hard as stone. Am I wrong? She lived here for 2 years, cooking, cleaning, childcare, paying for groceries and bills, jumping into everything. You've had it so easy that the second she's gone, you miss her. But Hannah, nothing in this world is truly free forever. I stood in the middle of the living room, still holding my phone. Mark was out, on the balcony. He heard everything, but he didn't come in right away. Perhaps he also wanted to see if this time I would dare speak for myself, or if I would just let it slide again. I looked at my biological mother and suddenly felt utterly exhausted. My mother-in-law isn't calculating like you think she is, Mum. You've been here for a few days, you've seen it. You know how much she did. Susan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It's exactly because she did so much that I'm afraid. When someone is too good to you, you owe them a debt for life. Later. On, when she's old, when she's ill, when she's bedridden. Would you dare not to care for her? At that point, her family just needs to say, remember how she looked after you back then? Could you ever argue with that? The room fell dead silent. Daisy was sleeping in the bedroom, the humidifier humming steadily. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. I had never considered that my mother viewed Margaret's kindness through that lens. In my eyes, my mother-in-law did those things because she loved her children and grandchild. In my mother's eyes, that sacrifice was a soft rope. The softer it was, the harder it was to untie. I was angry because my mum's words were harsh, but I was also afraid because I couldn't entirely deny them. The phrase, "owe a debt," fell from my mother's lips and rolled into my heart, touching the exact spot I always tried to avoid. I replied slowly, weighing every word as if untangling a knot. If my mother-in-law falls ill later on, caring for her is the right thing to do. She's Mark's mum, she's Daisy's gran, and she's someone who genuinely loved me. My mum looked at me, her eyes gradually turning red. You talk a good game, but tell me this. When you're busy caring for her, who's going to care for me? Once a daughter marries, her husband's family only needs to show a bit of decency and she forgets her own old mother back home. When I speak bluntly, you get annoyed. When she speaks softly, you're moved to tears. I lost the battle the moment I opened my mouth, didn't I? That sentence left me speechless. Behind my mother's harsh words, I suddenly saw a very old, deep-seated sense of feeling slighted. She wasn't just jealous of my mother-in-law overlooking after the baby. She was afraid of losing her daughter, afraid that I would sit in this flat eating meals cooked by my mother-in-law and let my child call her gran before calling me Nana. And that one day, when she was sick back in Yorkshire, I would just send money and say I was too busy. Old people have very clumsy fears. They don't know how to articulate them gently, so they turn them into blame, criticism, and control, wounding the placed listener before they can even understand what the older person is actually afraid of. Mark stepped in then. He stood by the balcony door, his voice tired but not aggressive. Susan, Hannah won't forget you, but please don't use your fear of her owing my family to completely dismiss my mother's good heart. Susan whipped her head around, her eyes flashing as if her pride had been struck. I am speaking to my daughter. Mark stayed silent for a second, then nodded. Yes, I know, but my mother is the one being talked about. I have to say something just to be fair. The atmosphere in the room tightened, but this time I didn't think Mark was wrong. If the person being spoken about was my mother, I probably couldn't have stayed quiet either. That evening, nobody ate much. My mum went into her room early. Mark went out to the balcony again. After putting Daisy to sleep, I went out and saw him standing alone, holding a cigarette that had burned halfway down. Mark had quit smoking when I got pregnant because Margaret hated the smell of smoke and worried it would affect the baby. It had been over a year since I'd seen him smoke, yet on the small ashtray next to a plant pot, 3 cigarette butts lay bare, their gray ash crumbling in the wind. I stood behind him and asked softly, "When did you start smoking again?" Mark startled, quickly stubbing the cigarette out like a child caught misbehaving. He gave a tired smile. Just the last few days. I know I shouldn't. I'll stop tomorrow. The promise sounded so painfully weak. I stepped closer, looking down at the does. Communal garden. Down there, the rosebush was barely visible in the yellow glow from the street lamp, its leaves rustling slightly. In the past, Margaret used to hold Daisy out here, looking at the bush, saying she wondered if it would bloom nicely this year. Back then, I just hummed in agreement because I was busy, checking work emails. Now, standing next to Mark amidst the smell of cigarette smoke, I remembered every tiny detail about her, like remembering a home I had just lost. Mark spoke, his eyes still fixed on the ground below. I know your mom loves you. I also know you're stuck in the middle. But I miss my mum, Hannah. There was no blame in that sentence, yet it hurt more than any accusation. I reached out and took my husband's hand. His hand was rough, smelling of smoke, and washing up liquid, no longer the hand that only held a phone after work. I whispered, I miss Mum too. Mark turned to look at me. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, which then softened. Perhaps that was the first time I had called Margaret Mum with such absolute sincerity, not out of politeness, not out of duty, but out of genuinely missing her. That night I couldn't sleep. Daisy's fever had broken. Mark, exhausted, had fallen fast asleep next to the baby. In the spare room, my mum hadn't turned the post. TV back on. The flat was so quiet that I could hear the fridge humming, the drip of a tap that wasn't shut tightly, the wind sweeping through the cracks in the quarter. Balcony door. I opened my phone, went into my WhatsApp chat with Margaret, typed a few words, and deleted them. Mum, I'm sorry. Delete. Please come back to us, Mum. Delete. I miss you. Delete. There are words that seem so easy to say, but when you need to say them, you realize you owe someone so much for so long that you don't even know where to begin. Towards morning, I finally managed to close my eyes. In a hazy half-sleep, I thought I heard the very soft scuff of fabric slippers in the living room, the sound of water boiling in the kitchen, and Margaret's voice calling, Hannah, eat some porridge before you go to work, love. I opened my eyes. The room was still dark. Beside me were only a sleeping Daisy and Mark's steady breathing. The kitchen out there was stone cold. That fleeting dream made my nose sting so badly I had to bury my face in the pillow. On the morning of the 18th day, my phone lit up before anyone in the house was fully awake. A WhatsApp message from my mother-in-law. Not a single word. Just a photo. It was a photo of the English ivy she had taken from our balcony back to her village. Its green leaves draped over the edge of the pot, a few water droplets still clinging to them. Behind it was an old concrete patio and a moss-stained brick wall. I sat bolt upright, staring at the photo for a long time. No blame, no reminders, no asking when we would come and get her. Just a potted plant, nursed. Back to vibrant green, as if she were speaking in the only way she knew how. I am still here, still caring for the things you forgot. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone glowing in my hand, Daisy lying beside. Me no longer had a fever. Her cheeks were less red, her breathing steady and light. Mark, startled awake by my movement, saw me staring at the screen. He propped himself up, his voice groggy. What is it? I handed the phone to him. He glanced at it briefly, then said softly, Mum? Mrs. Home. I asked back, almost unconsciously, which mum? Mark fell silent for a few seconds. The morning light from the window was just enough to illuminate the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept peacefully in days, and who didn't know who to feel sorry for. First. He handed the phone back, his voice dropping lower. Both. That answer left me speechless. It was true. One mother in the countryside, sending a photo of a plant to say she still missed the home she used to care for. One biological mother in the very next room, also longing to secure her absolute place in her daughter's life. Two forms of longing, pulling in two different directions. And I stood in the middle, holding my child, my heart full of things unsaid. The kitchen that morning smelled of plain porridge. When I stepped out, my mum had already been up for a while. She was standing by the cooker, stirring a pot of porridge with Margaret's wooden spoon. On the dining table was a small plate of pickles, 2 boiled eggs, and some slices of ham she had brought from Yorkshire. It was the first breakfast my mom had proactively cooked since she arrived. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't as fragrant as the breakfasts Margaret used to prepare, but seeing my mom's silhouette hunched over the stove, her silver hair mixed into a loose bun, my heart suddenly softened. Hearing my footsteps, my mom turned around. Her voice was still stern, but the faked it is. Prickliness of the past few days was gone. "You're up. Eat. The porridge is plain, add salt if you want it. Don't go complaining that it's not as good as your mother-in-law's." That last sentence should have annoyed me, but that morning I just felt a wave of sadness. The hand my mum used to hold the bowl trembled slightly, not from anger, but because old age was beginning to show in the places she tried to hide. When I was young, those hands patched clothes, sharpened pencils, chopped veg, and cut hair for 3 children with lightning speed. Now, just holding a full bowl of porridge made her wrists shake. I took the bowl from her and said, "I'm not complaining, Mum. Sit down, let me get a spoon." Susan glanced at me, probably unaccustomed to hearing me soften my tone after days of tension. She sat down, pulling her chair out a bit forcefully, and looked towards the bedroom where Daisy was still lying. "Is she really better?" I nodded. "Much better. I'll give her another dose of medicine in a bit." My mum let out a very faint sigh. Last night she must have been terrified too. It's just that my mother's fear didn't turn into apologies. It turned into plain porridge, boiled eggs, and a rigid posture at the dining table. Mark came out from the back. Seeing breakfast on the table, he looked slightly surprised. He said politely, "Thank you, Susan." My mum didn't look at him. She just replied, "Eat it. It's getting cold." The words weren't gentle, but they weren't biting either. Mark pulled out a chair, broke a boiled egg in half, and gave me one piece. That moment was strangely ordinary, but in a flat that had been strung as tight as a violin. String for over a fortnight, a breakfast where no one slammed their cutlery, no one criticized, and no one stormed off to the sofa felt like a small gift. I ate a few spoonfuls. It was so bland I had to add some ham, but there was still a lump in my throat. Seeing this, my mum immediately said, "If it's not to your taste, add some salt. Don't sit there forcing it down like medicine." Mark almost laughed out loud, quickly burying his face in his bowl. I also let out a very slight, stifled laugh. That tiny sound made my mum pause. Then she looked away, the corners of her mouth twitching slightly. Over the past few days, this was the first time the flat had something resembling a clumsy, awkward but genuine family atmosphere. After breakfast, Mark took Daisy into the living room to give her her medicine. The baby was feeling better, so she started resisting, turning her face away and clamping her lips shut. My mum sat next to them, instinctively directing, "Operations. Slower. Don't pour it too fast or she'll choke. Tilt the spoon. Down like that. Where's the tissue? Wipe her mouth." Mark followed her instructions. He was a bit clumsy, but he didn't lose his temper. Daisy spat a mouthful of medicine and milk onto his shirt, leaving a prop and a white stain on his shoulder. He just sighed, grabbed a cloth to wipe it, and continued coaxing, "Good girl, Daisy. Finish this and Daddy will show you the cats down in the garden." The shirt Mark was wearing was the one Margaret had bought for him last winter. Light blue, soft fabric, not expensive, but it fit perfectly. I remembered when she brought it home. Mark even teased her. "You always buy things for me. Buy something for yourself for once, Mum." She laughed. "I'm old. Anything will do. You need to look smart for work." I had been busy changing Daisy's nappy at the time and barely paid attention. Now, looking at the milk stain on the shoulder of that shirt, I suddenly realized that during her 2 years living with us, Margaret hadn't bought a single new item of clothing for herself. Her frayed cardigan still lived, somewhere in my memory, along with the phrase, "I only wear it around the flat. Who's going to see?" Mark took Daisy away to change his shirt while I went out to the balcony to take down the laundry. Down in the communal garden, the rose bush was blooming, bright red. The small flowers looked like sparks against the bright green leaves in the morning sun. On the bench beneath it, a few elderly residents were chatting. One pointed at the bush and remarked that it would be a good year for it. I stood high above, looking down, suddenly remembering how my mother-in-law used to hold Daisy, leaning against the railing, looking at the bush and saying, "I wonder if it will bloom nicely this year, eh?" I had just said, "Yeah, very quickly because I was staring at work emails. A small question from her, and I had never truly answered it. The photo of the English ivy was still on my phone. I opened it again. The glossy green leaves had been wiped clean, exactly the way she used to wipe every leaf on my balcony. Perhaps she had taken it back with her when she left, or Mark had handed it to her at the coach station without me noticing. Even a potted plant was cared for as meticulously as a person, and we, the people who received the most from her, let her leave with a canvas bag and an angry excuse, just to save face for her daughter-in-law. Thinking about that, I no longer felt I had only wronged my mother-in-law. I felt I had lived carelessly with kindness itself. Late that morning, my mum went into the spare room and started packing. The plane is sender dashes a 1919-011. Sound of a bag zipping shut made me jump. I walked in and saw her folding her clothes and her Pilates book, stuffing them next to a bottle of Vicks. On the bed lay a half-eaten packet of biscuits and the flannel she had brought from home. I asked, "What are you doing, Mum?" She didn't look at me, answering curtly, "I'm going home tomorrow." The sentence came suddenly, but I wasn't entirely surprised. Perhaps, since breakfast, I had a premonition she would leave. I sat on the edge of the bed and asked softly, "Are you angry with me, Mum?" She zipped the bag up, pulling a bit too hard, but her voice was lower. "Why? Would I be angry? Your dad is at home on his own. I've been away too long. I'm worried about him." I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Before she came, she had mentioned my dad was having meals at my aunt's house. There was no shortage of people checking in on him. But if my mum needed an excuse to retreat with her pride intact, I couldn't bear to expose it. Margaret had left using the excuse I missed the boss village. Now, my own mother was leaving using the excuse your dad is at home. Two mothers, two different ways of speaking, but both preserving a bit of peace, things of mind for their children. I held my mum's hand. That hand was rough, full of calluses, the palm warm but dry. She startled slightly, but let it be. I said, "You can stay a few more days, Mum. Daisy has only just recovered." Before I could finish, she interrupted. "Your mother-in-law will come back. That's what matters." The sentence still stung, but this time I heard more sorrow than anger. I squeezed her hand tighter. "Mum, I need you. But I also need to learn how not to let anyone carry all my burdens for me anymore. I was genuinely happy you came. It's just that our flat is small, and your personality and my mother-in-law's are different. I don't know how to arrange things so everyone feels they have space to breathe." My mum turned her face away. Her shoulders trembled once, very slightly. A long moment later, she said, "I know I speak harshly. I know, but I see how good she is to you, and it scares me. A daughter goes to her husband's family, and if they give her a bowl of soup, she has to be grateful, let alone someone doing all this for you. I'm afraid that later on, if you suffer, you won't dare complain." I felt tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. So, behind those prickly words was a mother who couldn't bring herself to believe her daughter could be loved without having to pay a price. Poverty, hardship, and her own years as a daughter-in-law had probably taught her to view kindness with suspicion. I rested my head on her shoulder, just like when I was little and would sneakily sit next to her after being scolded. My mum stiffened, but she didn't push me away. She just said in a hoarse voice, "Don't let anyone look down on you. That's all I'm saying." I replied, "I know. But please, don't look down on someone else's kindness just because you're afraid I'll be at a disadvantage." That sentence quietened the room. It wasn't the silence of anger, but the silence of two people finally touching each other's pain for the first time. That afternoon, my mum didn't say much. She helped me feed Daisy and showed me how to pat her back to clear the phlegm, but she didn't raise her voice. Even when Mark made a bottle of formula slightly too hot, she just reminded him to test a few drops on his wrist first. Mark looked up and politely said thank you. That slight softening arrived late, but it still made my heart feel more at ease. Adults perhaps don't change in a single day, but one day is enough for stop hurting each other if they choose to truly see each other. That evening, after Daisy was asleep, I went out onto the balcony alone. The rosebush down in the garden wasn't as bright red under the yellow street lamp as it was during the day, but you could still see the clusters of small flowers. My The phone was open to my WhatsApp chat with Margaret. The photo of the English ivy sat right at the top, green and silent. I typed a message. Daisy's fever is gone, Mum. Look after yourself. This time I didn't delete it. I hit send. 2 gray ticks appeared. A long time. Later, they turned blue. She replied simply, Good. Go to sleep early, love. No blame. Still no blame. And that was exactly what made my heart ache. My mum, in the next room, probably wasn't asleep either, because the light under her door was still on late into the night. I lay between my husband and my baby, listening to the steady hum of the fridge, my mind replaying every scene from the past 18 days. My mother-in-law's canvas, bag, the criticized dinners, the 38.5 degrees Celsius fever, the cigarette on the balcony, my own mother's trembling hand, the silent photo of the plant. They all stacked up to form a very clear question. How long will I continue letting people love me in a way that causes so much Pliarden and Italim in a way? Pain? Near midnight, the door to the spare room creaked open. I heard my mum walk to the kitchen to pour some water, then stop outside Daisy's room for a while. She didn't come in. She just stood outside the door for a very long time. Then, the sound of her slippers retreated back to her room. Tomorrow morning, my mum would. I say she was leaving because my dad was alone in Yorkshire with no one to look after him. But in that moment, I knew she had understood far more than she was willing to say out loud. There are mothers who never apologize to their children with words. They just leave a little earlier so their children don't feel awkward. The next morning, while I was making Daisy's formula, my mum had already dragged her canvas bag into the living room, wearing a navy blue raincoat that was faded. At the cuffs, she didn't announce she was leaving with an angry tone, nor did she make a fuss like the previous days. She just stood at the bedroom door, looked at Daisy sitting in her cot, and said softly, Take me to the coach. Station in a bit, Hannah. I booked the 10 o'clock. The bottle in my hand paused. Even though I had guessed it, hearing her actually say it still made my heart skip a beat. Mark stepped out of the bedroom, his hair still wet from the shower. Hearing this, he froze for a few seconds, then said politely, Stay a few more days until Daisy is fully recovered, Susan. I can book tomorrow off and drive you back. My mum waved her hand, a very familiar wave of hers, both decisive and attempting to hide her softness. No need. Your dad is home alone. I don't feel right. Besides, staying here is too cramped. I can't sleep properly. The word cramped didn't just refer to the flat. I knew our 2-bedroom flat was small, but the most cramped space was the fact that everyone had their own way of loving, yet no one knew how to make room for anyone else's. My mum had come up with the intention of helping her kids, only to discover that her daughter's home was already covered by the shadow of another mother covering Ellaby Day. Every habit, every object, every call from the grandchild. She wanted to squeeze in to prove that a biological mother is the one who understands her child best. But the harder she tried to prove it, the further she pushed herself away. Breakfast that morning saw no one eating much. My mum only drank half a bowl of porridge, saying she could eat some biscuits on the coach. I peeled an apple for her. She picked up a slice, then put it down, saying, My teeth have been aching lately. Can't enjoy food. A very small sentence, yet it left me stunned. I didn't know since when her teeth had been aching. I didn't know her knees hurt so much she had to rub ointment on them every night. I didn't know her hair had gone so gray. I always thought a mother would stand forever in the same spot, waiting for me to turn around and see her. But the truth was, while I was busy being a wife, a mother, and a daughter-in-law, my own mother was growing older by the day. On the way to the coach station, my mum sat in Mark's car. I held Daisy and followed in a taxi because I was afraid the baby, having just recovered, shouldn't be exposed to the wind. The morning traffic was heavy, cars jostling, horns honking. Daisy dozed off on my shoulder, occasionally nuzzling her face against my neck. Through the taxi window, I saw my mum sitting in the passenger seat of Mark's car, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her back slightly hunched. A woman who had once carried an entire family on her shoulders now looked incredibly small sitting next to her son-in-law. At the station, my mum wouldn't let me carry her bags. She grabbed them back, saying, It's just a few clothes, I can carry them. You hold Daisy, don't let her catch a chill. I stood next to her under the station canopy. Around us was the sound of announcements, people buying coffees, the rattle of suitcases on the pavement. My mum bent down to look at Daisy, reaching out a finger to gently touch her granddaughter's cheek. The baby, still recovering, wasn't smiling much. But, seeing her Nana, she reached out and grabbed the drawstring of her raincoat. My mum immediately turned her face away, pretending to look for her coach. I called out softly, "Mum." She didn't turn back right away. Perhaps she was afraid that if she looked at me, for a second longer she would say something vulnerable and she wasn't used to. Letting her children see her vulnerable. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Don't be angry with me, Mum, I know you. Came to help. It's just that the past few days have been chaotic, and if I said anything out of line, please forgive me." My mum zipped her bag, checking her ticket before replying. "What good is it? Being angry? You have your own home, your husband, your child. If I talk too, I just become a spare part." Hearing the phrase spare part made my heart ache. I quickly said, "You're not a spare part, Mum. You're my mother." Susan turned to look at me, her eyes red, but her mouth remained stubborn. "Because I'm your mother, you find it annoying to listen to me," an outsider says. One gentle word. And you remember it for a lifetime. I say 10 words and you just find me a nuisance, but fine. I need to change my ways too. If I don't, no one will want me visiting my granddaughter in the future. I wanted to hug her, but I was holding Daisy in one arm and the bag of baby medicine in the other. That clumsy awkwardness meant mother and daughter stood facing each other with a gap still between them. In the end, I just grabbed my mum's hand. She squeezed it back very quickly, then let go. She reminded me to give Daisy her medicine for the full course, not to wrap her up at night, to change her nappies regularly, and not to be stingy. And you, make sure you eat properly. Don't skip meals just because you're busy. Those words weren't much different from what Margaret used to say. They just came through a more prickly mouth, so for the longest time I had assumed they weren't love. When it was time for the coach to leave, my mum stepped aboard without looking. Back immediately. I stood below, watching her, my throat so tight I could only manage to say, "Ring me when you get back." She nodded and found a window seat. As the coach rolled away, I saw her turn her face to the glass, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but the glare on the window meant I couldn't see clearly. Daisy woke up right then, waving her arms towards the coach, babbling. I lifted her higher, smiling at my tude. Mum through the window. This time, Susan raised her hand very slightly. Returning to the flat, it was strangely quiet. No TV blaring from my biological mum, no soft scuffing of my mother-in-law's slippers, just the hum of the fridge, and the sound of Daisy chewing on a toy in her playpen. On the coffee table lay the half-eaten packet of biscuits my mum had left, a half-drunk glass of water, and the Pilates book lying face down on a page about joint pain. I picked each item up, not knowing whether to put them away or leave them. Every mother who leaves behind a few small objects that, when they were there, felt like clutter. Once they are gone, those things suddenly become proof that they tried so hard to belong to this home. Mark stood out on the balcony, leaning against the railing. He wasn't smoking, but the ashtray still held the old cigarette butts that hadn't been emptied. I carried Daisy out to him. Husband and wife looked down at the communal garden, where the rosebush was beginning to drop a few red petals onto the path. A moment later I said, "Let's go and bring Mum back." Mark turned to me, his eyes very deep. He didn't ask which mum this time. Perhaps he knew. He just asked, "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I'm sure. But we're not bringing Mum back to keep doing what she did before. I don't want your mum coming down here and waking up at 5:30, cooking, washing, looking after the baby, paying for groceries while we act like it's a given. I want to bring her back because this is her home too. But it has to be a home where she can rest, not a home that needs her to keep it running." Mark looked at me for a very long time, the breeze from the balcony ruffling his hair slightly. Over the past few days, I noticed my husband had aged a bit. Not because of time, but because for the first time, he saw just how much his mother had been holding this family up. He took out his phone and dialed Margaret's number. Before calling, he met my eyes one last time. I told him, "Tell her I want her to come back." The phone rang. Every ring stretched like a taut string in my chest. When? Margaret answered. Mark tried to keep his voice steady. Mom, I'm coming to pick you up tomorrow. The other end was silent, just the sound of the wind and a noise like a watering can being set down on the pavement. Mark looked at me, then continued, his voice softening. Hannah told me to call you back. Come stay with us, Mum. Daisy misses you. The other side remained silent for a very long time. So long I thought the signal had dropped. Then a very small sound came through the speaker like someone trying to hold back a sob but failing. Mark lowered his head, his eyes red. Don't cry, Mum. I'll be there early. Tomorrow. Standing beside him, holding Daisy, hearing my mother-in-law cry through the phone, felt like someone had placed a warm, heavy stone on my chest. It was heavy, but it also let me know I still had a chance to fix things. That evening, I tidied up Margaret's room. The sheets my own mum had slept on were stripped and washed, the pillows taken out to air on the balcony, the window open to let the breeze in. When I pulled open the bottom drawer of the Dakshin wardrobe to get a new duvet cover, I saw Margaret's blanket again. It was still shoved deep inside the plastic bag I had pushed it into the day she left. I took it out, dusted it off lightly. The faint smell of old washing powder drifted up, just an ordinary scent, yet it made my nose sting fiercely. Mark walked in just as I was sitting on the edge of the bed hugging the blanket. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down next to me. I looked at the dotty anything at first, blanket, and whispered, "You know." The day she left, I actually felt relieved. I'm an awful person. Mark let out a soft breath. I'm awful too. She was here for 2 years, and I just let her look after me like I was a kid. I kept thinking she could handle it, that she liked doing it. The truth is, I was just too lazy to realize she gets tired too. The room fell quiet. The two of us, nearly 30 years old, parents ourselves, yet it took losing the quiet presence of an elderly woman in our home to learn our BBU. First lesson about gratitude. I folded the blanket and placed it on my pocket. Mother-in-law's bed. This time, I didn't shove it into the wardrobe. Out in the living room, Daisy was sleeping soundly. In the kitchen, the pot of porridge I was prepping for tomorrow morning was bubbling away. It was a bit thick, but it smelled good. I knew I would still be clumsy. I would still forget things. I would still make mistakes. But perhaps fixing a mistake doesn't start with a grand promise. It starts with cooking a pot of porridge yourself, washing a bedsheet yourself, and taking the blanket of the person you once took for granted and placing it exactly where it belongs. The next morning, Mark woke up very early to drive to Yorkshire to pick his mum up. Before leaving, he stood at the door, looking at the kitchen with the lights on as I bustled around washing veg. He asked, half joking, half serious, "Are you sure you don't need me to stay and rescue the kitchen?" I held up a bunch of spring onions and glared at him. "You just go and get Mum. If the kitchen burns down today, I'll take full responsibility." Mark laughed, a much lighter laugh than he'd had in days. He bent down to kiss Daisy's forehead as she sat in her playpen, then turned to me. "If Mum comes home and sees you cooking, she'll think she's walked into the wrong flat." That joke made me both laugh and feel a pang of bitterness. It was true. If my mother-in-law saw me cooking first thing in the morning before, she would have panicked. Not because I couldn't cook, but because she had never allowed herself to believe she could just sit still. Once Mark left, it was just me and Daisy in the flat. The baby, having just recovered, was a bit clingy, so I strapped her into a baby carrier on my chest while I cleaned the kitchen. If Margaret had seen that, her heart would have ached and she would have run in saying, "Let me do it." But today, I wanted to do it myself, not to prove I was capable, and certainly not to put on an apologetic show. But because, for the first time, I understood that a family meal isn't just food. It is time, effort, attention. It is everything the cook silently pours into the dishes, which the people eating usually swallow down far too quickly. At nearly 8 a.m., I carried Daisy down to the local high street market. The morning market was busy. The smell of fresh herbs, fish, warm meat, and the fade chatter of haggling blended into something very real. The butcher I usually bought from saw me and looked surprised. "Oh, the daughter-in-law is doing the light shopping today? Where's Daisy's gran?" I smiled awkwardly. She went back to the village for a few days. "She's coming back today. I'm buying some pork chops for dinner to welcome her." The butcher picked out some good chops for me, chopping them while saying, "Your mother-in-law is so particular, you know. Every time she buys, she tells me not to chop them too small, terrified the baby might swallow a bone splinter. Such a gentle woman truly loves her grandkids." Hearing that, my hand gripped the handles of my shopping bags tighter. It turned out that even in this small market, my mother-in-law had left her mark, not through loud, boasting talk, but through tiny, meticulous requests, so very typical of her. Passing the greengrocer's, the woman there also asked, "Haven't seen Margaret? For a while. Did she move back?" I shook my head. "She's coming back this afternoon." The woman smiled. She always buys the softest greens for the baby. Once, it was pouring with rain, and she still came down just for a bunch of spinach, saying, her daughter-in-law works late and needs a hot bowl of soup. Standing in the middle of the market, surrounded by strangers, I suddenly wanted to cry. When I got back to the foyer of our building, Claire was holding little Leo. As soon as she saw me, she asked, "Is Daisy's gran back today?" "This afternoon, Claire," I replied. Hearing Daisy's gran, Leo cheered. "Gran gives me rice cakes." Claire laughed and ruffled his hair. "See? Kids remember forever. She's so sweet, always handing out treats to the kids in the communal garden. I've been asking for her all week." I held Daisy, noticing my daughter looking around as if searching for someone. Too, a person goes away for 20 days, and it turns out it wasn't just my flat. That felt empty. The corner of the communal garden felt empty too. Back home, I started cooking. The first dish was glazed pork chops. A dish Margaret made often, but I had never really asked for the recipe. I was a bit heavy-handed with the soy sauce and terrified of burning the sugar, so the color wasn't great. The spinach soup was too thick because I put too much veg in, and the garlic green beans were cooked on too high a heat, so they went a bit dark. Daisy sat in her high chair, randomly banging her spoon to her own chaotic rhythm. I cooked while watching a YouTube tutorial on my phone, sweat dripping down my neck, the kitchen looking like a war zone. At one point, standing amidst a sea of dirty plates, staring at the soup pot, the frying pan, the chopping board, and the unwashed veg, I just burst out, laughing. So that was it. Every time Margaret effortlessly placed a hot, perfect meat and 2-veg dinner on the table, it wasn't magic. It was over an hour of standing by the cooker. It was knowing what to cook first and what to cook last. It was remembering who liked things bland and who liked things spicy. Whether Daisy was awake or asleep, if there was enough rice in the cupboard, how long the gas would last. I had eaten those meals for 2 years, and the most I ever did was compliment her once. "This is nice today, Mum." Sometimes I even ate while staring at my Doctane phone. Just after 2 p.m., Mark called to say they were at the entrance to the estate. I immediately turned off the stove, hurriedly wiped my hands on a tea towel, and carried Daisy to the door. The baby, seeing my rush, giggled heartily, kicking her little legs against my stomach. The lift doors opened. Mark stepped out first, carrying the bags. Behind him was Margaret. Still the faded brown canvas bag from the day she left. Still the enamel mug, peeking out. Still the old fabric slippers. The only difference was her face was thinner, her skin a bit sallower, her eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept well in the village. I stood in the doorway, my throat completely tight. Margaret looked at me and gave a shy smile, identical to the one she gave the day she left. "I'm here to bother you two again." That one sentence hurt so much I nearly cried. The person who had looked after my home for 2 years the moment she returned was afraid she was a bother. I stepped forward, taking the bag from her hand, and said very softly, "You're home, Mum. There's no bother at all." She froze, probably because of the word home. Mark stood beside us, bending down to take his shoes off, but I saw his eyes were red. As soon as Margaret walked in, she looked around the living room. Seeing Daisy's toys scattered about and smelling the cooking from the kitchen, she instinctively rolled up her sleeves. "Let me see what's in the fridge. I'll cook." "Dinner." I quickly grabbed her hands. They were cold and light, the veins prominent under Seaver, her thin skin. Looking at those hands, I suddenly remembered that for 2 years, they had washed countless dishes, held my crying baby through countless nights, and rubbed my husband's tired back countless times. I said, "I've already cooked today. You just sit and play with Daisy." She stood there, stunned. Clearly she heard me, but it was as if she didn't comprehend it. You cooked? I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah. It's a bit salty, a bit bland, and a bit burnt, but it won't kill us, Mum. Mark burst out laughing. Margaret smiled too, but her smile contained a heartbreaking awkwardness. A person used to doing everything for others, when told to sit still, often doesn't know where to put their hands. She looked around and finally perched on the edge of the sofa, her back straight, ready to spring up the moment anyone needed her. I put Daisy down on the rug. The baby stared at her gran for a moment, seemingly unfamiliar after weeks apart. Margaret wasn't overwhelming. She just sat quietly and gently reached a hand out. Daisy, it's Gran. The baby tilted her head, then suddenly crawled over and reached her tiny hand up to touch her Gran's cheek. Just that single touch made Margaret's eyes instantly go red. She turned her face away, trying to smile. My granddaughter is so big now, she knows how to pinch Gran's cheeks. I stood in the kitchen and quickly turned the tap on full blast to drown out the sound of me taking a deep breath. There are scenes where no one needs to cry out loud for everyone's heart to be completely drenched. Dinner that night wasn't pretty. The pork chops were saltier than I thought, the soup was bland, the beans were overcooked, and the steamed egg I made for Daisy was full of holes like a honeycomb. I placed each dish on the table, too, embarrassed to even look at my mother-in-law. Margaret sat down and picked up a piece of pork. For a few seconds, my heart hung in the balance like waiting for exam results. She chewed slowly, then nodded. It's nice, goes perfectly with rice. Mark sat next to her, trying to suppress a laugh because he definitely knew it was too salty. But he took a huge bite and added, if you cook like this, Hannah, I can survive. I glared at my husband while Margaret smiled. That meal, she ate 2 bowls of rice. Mark did too. Daisy sat in her high chair, gnawing on a soft-boiled carrot, her face a mess. No one complained, no one rushed. At one point, when the soup was too bland, Mark stood up to get the salt. Margaret instinctively started to stand up with him, but I stopped her with a look. She sat back down, hands on, her knees looking at her bowl like someone trying to be a guest in her own family's house. After eating, I gathered the plates. Margaret reflexively stood up. Let me wash. Those, you watch, Daisy. I held the stack of plates tightly to my chest and shook my head. No. Today you. Sit down, I'm washing up. She looked at me, her lips trembling. But you've been at work all week, you're tired. I replied, you're tired too. You've been tired for 2 years, Mum. The moment I said that, the entire kitchen fell silent. Margaret lowered her head, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her cardigan, then she quietly walked back into the living room. As she passed me, I saw her quickly bring her sleeve up to wipe the corner of her eye. Mark came in to help me wipe the table. He grabbed a cloth and clumsily wiped the same spot 3 times, leaving streaks of water. I looked at him and laughed. You wipe a table like you're drawing a map. He shrugged. I'm a beginner. Have some sympathy for your student. Our soft laughter echoed in the kitchen, not loud but light. Out in the living room, Margaret was holding Daisy. The baby was resting against her chest as if they had never been apart. On Margaret's face, I saw a different smile than the one she had by the lift doors, and different from the awkward one when she first arrived. It was still gentle, still reserved, but it held a genuine warmth. That night, after Daisy was asleep, I sat with Mark at the dining table, a small notepad in front of me. I wrote down the weekly chores: shopping, cooking, washing up baby's laundry, taking Daisy for a walk, cleaning the flat, buying formula, nappies, checking medication. Mark looked at the long list and exhaled. Did Mum really do all of this? I replied, not just this. There's a lot more we don't even remember to write down. He went quiet, took the pen, and wrote his name next to several lines. Evening, washing up, taking the bins out, heavy shopping, taking Daisy to the garden on weekends so Mum can rest. I put my name next to weekend breakfasts, prepping baby's things, monitoring, medicine and supplies. On the final line, I wrote, Mum gets a lie in at least 2 days a week. Mark read that line and laughed. If Mum sleeps in, she'll think the flat is on fire. I laughed too, but my eyes stung. From Margaret's bedroom came the sound of a soft cough, not severe, but enough to remind me that she wasn't always Absolutely fine, like she claimed. I closed the notepad and looked at my husband. We have to actually do it, okay? Let's not keep it up for a few days. And then go back to how things were. Mark nodded. This time he wasn't joking. Yeah, we do it. But doing it turned out to be much harder than writing it down on paper. On the first Saturday morning after my mother-in-law returned, I set an alarm for 6 a.m. to make porridge. It rang 3 times before I managed to drag myself out of bed. My hair was a bird's nest. My eyes were half shut because Daisy was teething and had fussed for over an hour the night before. The moment I opened the bedroom door, I saw Margaret standing in the kitchen, holding a pot of half-washed rice. She turned around, looking like a child caught doing something wrong. I'm used to the time. I couldn't sleep. I leaned against the doorframe, wanting to both laugh and cry. Mum, today is my turn. She looked at the pot of rice, then at me, then at the clock, flustered. But you go back to sleep for a bit. I'll have this done in a flash. I walked over and gently took the pot from her hands. Go back to bed for half an hour, Mum. Even if you can't sleep, just lie there. The flat won't burn. Down. Margaret still wasn't reassured. She stood watching me turn on the stove, watching me wash the meat, watching me open the fridge for spring onions. Only, when I urged her for the 3rd time, did she slowly walk back to her room, looking over her shoulder the whole way, like handing over a car to a learner. Driver. That morning's porridge was thick. I used too much oats, and terrified of burning the bottom, I stirred it constantly until it turned into wallpaper. Paste. Mark came out, looked at the pot, and offered a brutally honest verdict. Eat that and we'll be full until tomorrow. I held up the ladle, threatening him. He quickly threw his hands up in surrender. Margaret stood at her door, initially worried, but seeing us laughing, she started laughing too. Daisy sat in her high chair being spoon-fed watery porridge by her dad, her face scrunched up as if she'd been tricked. The kitchen was messy, the sink was full, the porridge wasn't great, but no one rushed in to take over anyone else's job anymore. The new rhythm of our household began with clumsiness like that. Mark learned to make bottles at the right temperature. The first time he tested it on his wrist, he yelped that it was hot. Margaret almost stood up to do it for him, but I held her hand back. He learned to change nappies at night. Once, he put it on crooked, making Daisy uncomfortable, and she cried her eyes out. Margaret was in such distress for her grandchild that she paced outside the Cludenipadian bedroom door. I had to fix the nappy while calling out, "Let Mark learn, Mum. A. Father can't go his whole life without knowing left from right on a nappy." She sighed upon hearing that. All right, let him learn. That sigh was still full of anxiety, but she had stopped trying to shoulder it all herself. Margaret also learned. She learned to sit still when someone else was washing the dishes. She learned to let Mark take out the rubbish, even if the bag wasn't tied perfectly. She learned to eat the breakfasts I cooked, whether the porridge was thick or thin. She learned to accept a new piece of clothing without saying, "Save the money for formula." The time I handed her a light beige cardigan, she held it, feeling the fabric, for a very long time, and her first question was still, "Was this expensive, love?" I replied, "Not as expensive as all the shirts you bought your son over the last 2 years." She laughed and scolded me for talking nonsense, but that night I saw her hang the cardigan on the bedpost, occasionally reaching out to stroke the fabric like a child with a new toy. With my biological mother, things didn't miraculously smooth over instantly, either. 2 days later, when she was back in Yorkshire, I called her. She answered, but her tone was still clipped. I asked if my dad had eaten, if her knees were feeling better. She just answered yes or no. It wasn't until I mentioned that Margaret had come back down that she stayed quiet for a moment, before saying, "That's good, someone to look after the baby for you." If it were before, I would have rushed to explain, afraid she was misunderstanding. But this time I slowed down and spoke clearly. "Mum, I want anyone doing my share of the work anymore. My mother-in-law is here, but we are dividing the chores. Whenever you want to come and see Daisy, just let me know. I still want you here. It's just that I don't want you and my mother-in-law having to put up with each other in a cramped flat." There was a long silence on the other end. I heard the chickens in her garden, my dad coughing, the sound of her pulling a chair out. Finally, Susan replied, "You're speaking like an adult now, aren't you? I laughed, my eyes a bit teary. I am a mother now, Mum. She scoffed lightly, but her voice was less cold. Send me a photo of Daisy. And don't go buying expensive coats for your mother-in-law and forgetting your own. Mother. The words were still prickly, but I heard a door creaking open within them. I answered. I'll buy you a different one. Do you prefer blue or purple? She scolded me for having too much time on my hands, but she didn't hang up right. Away. One afternoon, Margaret took Daisy down to the communal garden. Mark and I went with them. Claire, the neighbor, saw her and cheered. Oh, Margaret's back. The kids have been talking about you. Little Leo ran over to show off a toy car. Daisy clung to her gran and refused to be put down. Margaret smiled kindly, reaching into her pocket for some small rice cakes to share with the kids. But this time, she handed one to me first. You see if Daisy can eat this. I won't. Just give it to her without asking any more. Just one small sentence, but I heard the change in both of us. She still loved her granddaughter, but she was starting to let me be the mother. And for the first time, I felt I wasn't being stripped of a role I had previously been too lazy to claim. Our flat wasn't as sparkling clean as before. Truthfully, it wasn't. Some days, dishes sat in the sink until evening. Some days, Daisy's toys stayed under the sofa for 2 days before we found them. Some days, Mark forgot to buy nappies and had to run down to the Tesco Express at 10 p.m. Margaret often looked at the placed, untidy spots, her fingers twitching, but then she would pour herself a glass of water, sit down, and watch Daisy play. I knew she was exercising extreme restraint, so I occasionally teased her. Mum, if you tidy everything up, we'll just get lazy again. She'd give me a fond glare. If you know that, then tidy it up yourself. One evening, Mark was washing up in the kitchen. I was bathing Daisy, and Margaret was sitting in the living room watching a drama. That scene was so ordinary that if I told an outsider, they wouldn't find anything special about it. But for me, it felt like a milestone. 2 years ago, the person washing up would definitely be her. The person bathing the baby would often be her too. Mark would be on the sofa on his phone, and I would be catching up on work. Emails. Now, everyone had taken back a piece of their own life, clumsy but real. Peace no longer came from one person doing everything so others could relax. It came from everyone knowing how to bend down a little. My mother-in-law still woke up early. The habit of a lifetime couldn't be broken instantly, but on the third Sunday morning, she slept until 7:30. When she woke up, she rushed out in a panic, her hair messy, her cardigan half-buttoned. Oh, no, I overslept. What has Daisy eaten? Where's the porridge? I was sitting on the rug playing with the baby and pointed to the kitchen. Mark cooked it. The bottom is a bit burnt, but the top is fine. Mark poked his head out of the kitchen, looking very serious. I scraped the lodi. Burnt bit off. Nobody's going to die. Margaret stood in the middle of the living room, looking at us for a moment, and then burst out laughing. That laugh was completely different from the one by the lift doors and different from the awkward one when she first came back. It wasn't thin, it wasn't reserved, it wasn't trying to hide anything. It rang out, truly, making the wrinkles around her eyes deeper but brighter. Daisy, seeing her gran laugh, laughed too, and crawled over to hug her legs. Watching that scene, I suddenly understood that healing isn't always about grand declarations of forgiveness. Sometimes it's just an elderly woman oversleeping, without feeling she's been left behind by the world. It's a slightly burnt pot of porridge that someone is still willing to eat. It's a toddler crawling over placed to hug her gran's legs as if saying, "You are allowed to rest, and you are still loved." That afternoon, I video called my biological mum. Susan was sitting on the patio, back in Yorkshire. Behind her, the trellis my dad had just rebuilt. As soon as Daisy saw her Nana on the screen, she laughed and slapped the phone. My mum's voice instantly softened as she cooed at her grandchild, then looked at me and asked, "Where's your mother-in-law?" I panned the camera. Margaret was sitting at the dining table trimming green beans. Seeing my mum, she awkwardly greeted her. "How are you doing, Susan?" My mum paused for a beat before replying, "I'm well. Look after yourself." Margaret, "Don't do too much. You have to make the young ones do it, or they'll get spoiled." That sentence almost made me laugh out loud. Margaret smiled too and nodded. "Yes, I'm trying to learn. Two mothers don't become best friends after one phone call. Real life isn't as easy as a movie. But they were able to say something to each other without sharp edges, and that was enough for a new beginning. After the call, my mum sent me a private text. The purple coat is fine, but don't spend too much. I held my phone and laughed for a long time. Mark asked what was so funny, so I showed him. He read it and declared, "Our mothers are exactly the same when it comes to not letting us buy expensive things." I replied, "Yeah, they're also exactly the same in how they love their children. But talk in circles until you're exhausted." Night fell, and the flat smelled of spinach soup. Mark was washing up after dinner, the water splashing loudly as if wanting to wash away all the old days. Margaret was sitting on the sofa wearing her new cardigan, holding Daisy and looking at a cloth book. I went out to the balcony to water the plants. The English ivy that she had taken home and brought back was placed in a sunny corner, its green leaves trailing down the side of the pot. Down in the communal garden, the rose bush had dropped most of its flowers, and in a few places, tiny, new buds were forming. I remembered what Mark said on the 18th day. Both mothers miss home. Now I understood. Home isn't a place where someone has to do everything just to be allowed to stay. Home has to be a place where people are allowed to be tired, allowed to make mistakes, allowed to rest, and allowed to be loved without paying for it with their exhaustion. Margaret called out from inside, "Hannah, don't water that one too much. It doesn't like being waterlogged." I laughed, calling back, "I know, Mum. Just sit still." She still wasn't completely at ease, but this time she didn't run out. Mark chimed in from the kitchen. "Let her learn, Mum. If she kills it, I'll buy a new one next month." I turned back to glare at my husband, and the whole family laughed. That laughter wasn't loud, but it filled our small flat with warmth. Looking back later, I still felt ashamed of the afternoon. I felt relieved when my mother-in-law walked away with her canvas bag. But if it weren't for those 20 days, perhaps it would have taken me much longer to see the things I had right. In front of me, a biological mother who loved her child through rough, anxious words, a mother-in-law who loved her daughter-in-law through silent endurance, a husband who had to relearn how to be a son, a husband, and a father. And me, a woman nearing 30, who finally understood that kindness isn't a soft bed for me to lie on. It is something I must cherish, reciprocate, and learn not to turn into a burden on someone else's shoulders. That night, before going to bed, I walked past Margaret's room. The door was slightly ajar. She was asleep. The old blanket was pulled over her tummy, and her new cardigan was hung neatly on the bedpost. In the glow of the nightlight, her face looked more peaceful than before. I stood watching for a moment, then gently pulled the door shut. Out in the living room, Mark was holding Daisy. The baby had fallen asleep on his shoulder, her mouth twitching as if she were having a happy dream. He looked at me and whispered, "What are you smiling at?" I shook my head and stepped over to lean against my husband's shoulder. Everything wasn't perfect, but from that day on, this home had started learning how to love each other the right way. On the balcony, the English ivy was still green, and down in the garden, the rose bush was quietly bearing its first fruit. Days would pass, not loudly, not sparkling clean like the times when one person carried the world on her shoulders. But every clink of a plate, every slightly salty meal, every morning Margaret got to sleep in would remind me of one thing. Some people don't leave to punish you. They leave so you have the chance to realize exactly how they were there for you. Indeed, there is love that is so quiet it is easily overlooked. A hot meal, a bottle prepared exactly on time, a clean shirt, a gentle reminder. If we receive it every day, we start to think it is a given. But in a family, no sacrifice is natural. Behind it is always the health, time, tears, and pride of someone who loves us very genuinely. This story does not force us to choose between a biological mother and a mother-in-law, but reminds us that all family love needs to be placed in its proper context, appreciated at the right time, and reciprocated through actions. We hope that after listening, everyone will look back at their own homes to see if there is someone silently carrying too much without ever being asked. Are you tired? What do you think about this story? Please leave a comment, press like, and subscribe to the channel to continue listening to more emotional, real-life stories.